Welcome to Dr. Creepin's Dungeon. Now, we're drawn to hi-fi horror stories because they blend the familiar with the unknown, pushing the boundaries of our fears into realms that are both imaginative and unsettling. These stories allow us to confront our anxieties about technology, the future, and the vastness of the universe, all within the safety of fiction. The thrill comes from exploring what-if scenarios, where scientific advancements lead to unexpected horrors, forcing us to question our understanding of reality and the limits of human control. The combination of speculative science and the primal fear taps into a deep curiosity and a love for the mysterious, making sci-fi horror a compelling genre that challenges us and captivates us, as we shall see in tonight's feature-length story. Now, as ever, before we begin, a word of caution. Tonight's tale may contain strong language as well as descriptions of violence and horrific imagery. If that sounds like your kind of thing, then let's begin.
From the halls of Montezuma to the depths of outer space, the long deployment. Part 1. We're set. Go. Second squad picked up from their firing positions and fell back 35 meters to where the first squad had set up to fire. As soon as the last member of second squad passed the first squad's firing positions, first squad unleashed murderous weapons fire back in the direction that second squad had just come from. The 30 Marines of second squad continued falling back, passing the Marines of the third squad, who were 35 meters behind the first squad and getting into position to fire. Then, as the last Marine of second squad passed the third squad's firing position, the third squad leader yelled, "We're set. Go." The Marines of first squad, now 35 meters to the front of the firing line, ceased firing and picked up all their weapons, falling back towards the third squad's position. Once the first squad Marine passed third squad's position, the third squad opened up and the rhythmic thunder of assault weapons fire began ringing out again. In seconds, second squad was 35 meters behind third squad and in position to fire. The second squad leader got down on one knee yelling, "We're set. Go." The third squad Marines ceased firing, picked up their weapons and sprinted back towards the second squad. Once the last third squad Marine passed the second squad line, the second squad Marines continued the unending fusillade of weapon fire. With a precision and timing honed through hours and days and weeks of constant combat maneuver training, the three squads of Marines, 42 Marines in all, fell back 200 meters down the metal corridor of the Star Freighter. Third squad reached the massive airlock first, and after the platoon leader punched in the code on the keypad mounted on the bulkhead, the heavy metal door slid open with a long hiss. Second squad crossed the airlock second, followed moments later by the 13 Marines of first squad. Once the last Marine had crossed the airlock, the Marines began firing back through the airlock as it slowly closed. Hideous creatures looking like demonically misshapen humans with bleeding pale yellow skin slammed against the closed airlock, but the airlock was massive and sturdily constructed and easily withstood the creatures trying to scratch and bite their way through the airlock's 4-inch armored glass and titanium steel frame. "Did we lose anyone? Anybody get hurt?" The question came from behind the enclosed combat helmet of a Marine wearing first lieutenant rank. "First squad, up. Second, up. Third herd, up." The lieutenant was standing a few feet from the airlock, with the hordes of demonic-looking humans banging and scratching furiously on the other side. "They're going to find another way around," the lieutenant said. Then, turning to his comm spec, he ordered, "Call in the gunship." Moments after the communication specialist made the transmission, the bulky grey-green shape of a Marine Helios gunship transport entered the open port dock and clamped down on the metal deck using the maglocks on the gunship's 3 landing struts. A 10-foot wide, hydraulically driven metal ramp was lowered amidships of the transport. The Marines, docking low, ran single file to the rear of the ship towards the lowered ramp, having to pass between 2 bulky armored pods which housed the Helios's 4 massive thrust-vectoring engines. The lieutenant was the last Marine to board the gunship. His body armor, MA-8 A3 rifle, and armored boots clanking up the metal ramp behind the rest of his platoon. The Helios gunship lifted up and turned, using its 6 smaller maneuvering thrusters as the rear ramp finally closed. The pilot pointed the nose towards the port dock opening and, engaging the 4 thrust-vectoring engines, shot out into open space. The gunship emerged out of the port dock at a trajectory that was perpendicular to the Corvo-class research freighter ship which they had just escaped. At a distance of 30 miles out, the gunship slowed, using its maneuvering thrusters to turn around and face the research freighter once again. The CSNS Montezuma was the 6th of the Corvo-class research freighter ships that were built at the Newport News aerospace shipyards and, at almost 350 meters long, was one of the larger research freighter ships constructed. The Montezuma was in orbit over a dead planet of rock simply named KXY 277D when the Marines were called. "Well, Lieutenant," said the gunship pilot, "what's the story?" Same old," replied the lieutenant. He'd entered the crew cockpit and was standing behind the pilot, who was seated in a well-padded and comfortable-looking seat, facing a bank of huge monitors set above a relatively narrow viewing screen. Scientists scavenging the galaxy for signs of intelligent life and alien technology. Scientists find some alien monument that seems out of place on a dead planet. Scientists take said monument onto their ship. Scientists get turned into demonic hellspawn. Marines come in, kick ass. "Huh," said the gunship pilot. "Third combat engagement this year for you guys. Are we employing the rules of engagement protocols?" Offset slightly to the rear and left of the pilot was the navigations officer, and seated slightly offset to her right was the weapons systems officer. "Yep," said the lieutenant as he removed his enclosed combat helmet and breathed in the cool, recycled cabin air. "Go for it." "You got it," answered the pilot as she adjusted the maneuvering thrusters. Turning to her right, she said, "Gunner, target research freighter CSNS Montezuma." "Roger," said the weapons systems operator. She'd anticipated the order and had already targeted the freighter, punching an order into a keypad on the weapons operation console. 2 huge metal panels opened on the port and starboard sides of the gunship from recessed pods. 2 rectangular canisters emerged from under each panel, each containing 4 188mm high-explosive, hypervelocity kinetic round launchers. Calculating the ordnance that the fire mission required and the necessary weapon trajectory, the gunner squeezed the trigger on the targeting joystick. The gunship rocked gently as one of the 188mm high-explosive rounds launched from one of the launchers, then another, then another, then another. There was a 2-second delay as the 4 high-explosive, hypervelocity rounds raced to their target. Then, in the span of a split second, all 4 rounds hit along the entire port side of the Montezuma and exploded, ripping it and hopefully the undead human scientist monsters to pieces. As the Montezuma came apart, the ship's nuclear reactors exploded in a brilliant flash of white light, before extinguishing itself as quickly as it had appeared. Whatever little remained of the ship burned to ash as it tumbled into the gravity of KXY 277D. "Good shooting, Gunner," said the pilot as she banked the gunship around and applied all thrusters on full. "Well, they'll never learn to leave well enough alone, will they?" said the gunner in a bored tone. "No, I guess not," said First Lieutenant Samuel Gabriel. "But if they did, we'd be out of a job." He turned to leave the cramped cockpit area of the gunship, making clanking noises as his M88A3 rifle, strapped across his back and his helmet clamped on his waist, banged against his body armor. He stomped down the 4 metal steps behind the cockpit and crossed the hatch leading into the cargo compartment where the other 40 Marines of his 4th Platoon Delta Company waited amongst stacks of giant olive drab guard, hard plastic container boxes of gunship weapon reloads. Lieutenant Gabriel was not looking forward to the damn paperwork he'd have to file when they got back. There were over 260 formerly human souls aboard the Montezuma, plus the freighter itself, and now they were all blown up. Hell, The last time he'd had to write a report like this, it was only for 12 research scientists doing a botanical study on a moon-orbiting planet WSS something or other. Lieutenant Gabriel could never remember the dizzying designations which had been assigned to the vast number of moons and planets which had been discovered in the past 50 years. Anyway, 4 months ago, a group of research scientists were working for one of the galaxy's giant pharmaceutical conglomerates, the one whose logo is, "The afflictions of Earth may be cured by a pill from space." 6 of those scientists had landed moonside, probably rolling around in the local fauna, and apparently had been contaminated by some kind of microscopic spore. When they didn't return to the ship, like a bunch of typical civilian idiots, 6 more scientists went down moonside to check on their friends. When they failed to return, the last 4 scientists probably would have, gone down to the surface if it weren't for the fact that the last team had taken the last of their 2 landing craft. Instead, they finally did the right thing and called the fleet for assistance, and Lieutenant Gabriel's platoon got the mission to respond. As it turned out, the spores had invaded the bodies of the 12 scientists, turning them into green, spongy, mossy, tentacled creatures. Lieutenant Gabriel would not have suspected that the creatures attacking were actually the missing scientists, until after his platoon was forced to blow them all away with small-armed weapons fire, and they discovered the scientists' identification badges deep inside the gooey green gore that used to be the spongy, mossy, tentacled creatures. The platoon incinerated the 2 landers with explosives before leaving Moon WSS whatever, and was designated off-limits for the time being. The platoon then spent an agonizing 24 hours in a decontamination chamber where none of the seals to the chamber could be breached, and therefore no food or water could be brought to the platoon. All of their uniforms, equipment, and weapons had to be surrendered and incinerated, meaning that all of the Marines had to share that one decontamination chamber, naked as the day they were born, which was awkward since 16 of the 42 Marines were females, making the 26 male Marines quite self-conscious. Afterwards, the entire platoon was kept in isolation, constantly being observed by doctors and medical staff. And after 2 weeks, when none of the Marines suddenly turned into homicidal geraniums, they were considered fit to return to duty. Well, that report was a nightmare for Lieutenant Gabriel to write, and this one would be worse. The Marines had unstacked and rearranged some of the plastic containers on the gunship's cargo bay to form makeshift benches and seats. Since the Helios gunship did not have hyperdrive capability, the stuff didn't need to be mag-locked to the deck and strapped down, as there was no danger of stuff flying around from hyperspace travel. The artificial grav would suffice. That's also why there were no restraining seats in the cargo bay for the Marines. They just sort of sat around, making themselves as comfortable as they could within the confines of that olive-drab metal bulkhead. Lieutenant Gabriel took a seat on one of the hard plastic containers, wishing that he had a fresh cup of coffee, and not the powdered Instabrew coffee that came in their mission ration meal kits, which tasted something like shoe polish dipped in dishwashing detergent. Oof, it will be a long 30-hour ride back to the carrier. "We saw the flash," said Staff Sergeant Tally, arcing her eyes. "Guess we nuked it." Lieutenant Gabriel yawned and nodded towards his second squad leader. "Yep, one more mysterious alien human mutating monument bites the dust." Staff Sergeant Boyer, the first squad leader, handed Lieutenant a nice hot canteen of shoe polish and detergent-flavored coffee, and Lieutenant Gabriel accepted it gratefully. "We're a week short," Boyer said, returning to his seat next to his disassembled M88 rifle, which he was cleaning. "Then we come off rotation for the next few months." "Don't jinx it," said Tally, hitting Boyer on his shoulder. Had Boyer been wearing his armor, he wouldn't have felt the hits, but he wasn't, and Boyer realized Tally didn't pull her punches. "Oh," said Boyer. "Hoorah," he said, rubbing his shoulder. Normally, Gabriel's 4th platoon would be basking in the afterglow of their mission adrenaline rush. They'd just neutralized a Level 1 ThreatCon, unidentified alien mutating structure, and had escaped with 0 casualties, even though they were outnumbered 6-1 by near bulletproof human mutant demons. But 4th Platoon was on week 3 of month 14 of their 15-month tour of duty, and they were tired. The Naval Fleet folks' tour of duty was less than half as long as the Fleet Marines, but the naval guys always received double the honors and recognition when their star cruisers pulled into space dock, even though the naval guys were usually cruising 350 miles to 400 miles above where the shooting was actually occurring. Gabriel's 4th Platoon Marines were spread out all over the cargo bay, either preparing mission ration meals, cleaning weapons, playing Call of Duty the Beta Nebulous missions, watching movies on their interphonics, or playing cards. The other half of the platoon was laid out on the floor or on cots, fast asleep in their sleeping bags. Private Hauser, 1st Squad's automatic rifle gunner, was a fan of the classics and was watching the vintage comedy movie Predator. Lance Corporal Chapman, affectionately known as Chaps, was the platoon's medic. He was conducting an impromptu Bible study with about 3 other Marines. It never ceased to amaze Lieutenant Gabriel that folks still believed in one all-powerful being, even after everything they'd experienced in the galaxy. But that religious faith was as strong now as it ever was before. Gabriel took a gulp of the coffee, thankful that Boyer put enough sugar, creamer, and hot sauce into the brew to kill the taste. He pulled out his hard-case datapad and began tapping out a draft copy of his mission report. He was trying to describe the most effective way to eliminate the mutated human demons that they'd battled aboard Mont Cabaru, should the horrors ever be encountered again. "Hey, Jency," he yelled over to the platoon's flame rifle gunner, who was assigned to the 3rd Squad. "How do you spell incinerate?" PFC Chency was sitting cross-legged on the ground, playing spades with 3 other Marines. She looked up from her cards and turned to look at her lieutenant. "Incinerate? B-O-O-M. Incinerate." This elicited a roar of laughter from the assembled Marines, and even Gabriel had to chuckle. "Smart ass," he said. Gabriel tossed his datapad back into his rucksack. He wasn't in the mood to write the report anyway. I give up. "Oh, damn it, Chency," said Sergeant Hernandez, the 3rd Squad leader. "Look at that. You broke the LT." More laughter echoed from the cargo bay. The Marines were tired from their over-year-long tour, but they could finally see light at the end of the deployment tunnel. Gabriel let them have their fun at his expense. They'd earned it. 15 months, 3 combat engagements, 0 casualties. All things good, considering that they never knew what they were engaging. Gabriel leaned back, still wearing his body armor, tried to get as comfortable as he could, resting his back against the ship's bulkhead, and closed his eyes. He'd have plenty of time to do the damn report during the 6-day trip that it would take for their carrier, the USS Kitty Hawk, to make the trip back to San Diego Orbital Naval Base. "Lieutenant Gabriel to the flight deck. Lieutenant Gabriel to the flight deck." Gabriel opened his eyes. It felt as if he'd just closed his eyes for a couple of minutes, but after checking his watch, it was 3 hours later. Gabriel groaned as he looked around. Most of the Marines who were still awake simply looked down, shaking their heads. When a Marine platoon leader gets called to the flight deck, it's usually for 2 things. 1, debrief the pilot on a mission that just ended, or 2, to receive orders of a new mission. Gabriel pressed the 2 quick-release slats on the upper shoulder of his body armor, and the bulky armor fell away. It was crowded enough in the cockpit without his clunking armor banging around. Gabriel got up, rolled his eyes, and disappeared through the hatch which led to the cockpit. Lieutenant Gabriel returned to the cargo bay relatively quickly. By then all of his Marines were awake and staring at him, pensively waiting for the bad news. Gabriel held up a hand, saying, "We're, taking a slight detour to rendezvous with the CSNS Maslev Wood, a luxury passenger liner. She's cruising around the Beltmore system about 10 hours from here." "Good Lord," said Private Hauser. "What is it now? Tall black skeleton-looking cyborg creatures with acid for blood that bust out of your chest? Fire-breathing mutated space dinosaur, said PFC Chansey. Ugly, flabby-looking, flesh-colored alien with long fingers, but a kind heart who's just looking to call home, said Corporal Cotto, a rifleman in second squad. No, said Lieutenant Gabriel. Geez, these Marines have been watching too many of Private House's vintage sci-fi comedy classics. We're just picking up a VIP to transport to the carrier. The CSNS Maslov Wood had engine trouble and is under tow to the Belmore Orbital Star Docks. None of his Marines groaned or protested, realizing that a 10-hour detour was far better than another last-minute mission. Besides, this was the Belmore Star Docks. The massive space station orbited over the planet Belmore 6, a bright blue Class 1 orb known for beautiful aqua blue seas, white sandy beaches, and lush green tropical islands. It was one of the more secluded systems, popular with those who could afford to travel to this exclusive vacation spot. Warrant Officer Nasri wanted to refuel and do a little maintenance at the Belmore docks, which would give the 4th Platoon Marines a few hours to eat chow at the Star Docks buffet and perhaps get in a quick shower. They hadn't had a decent meal and a chance to properly wash since the mission had begun 12 days ago, so this was an opportune time. Lieutenant Gabriel gathered up the small VIG cards, which were inserted in each of the Marines' helmets. Each helmet contained a small camera which automatically recorded every time a Marine squeezed the trigger of their weapon. It also recorded whenever a Marine flipped a record lever located in a small recess in their upper right breastplate armor. The camera was a requirement of Congress to keep the military honest and reduce the incidence of war crimes since, apparently, no one in the military could be trusted. As such, after every mission, all recordings on VIG cards needed to be sent up through the chain of command as soon as possible and, following SOP, Gabriel uploaded all 42 VIG cards into a transmitter panel and forwarded the videos to his CO and the ops officer aboard the USS Kitty Hawk. 11 hours later, after the gunship had arrived at the Belmore Star Docks, any thoughts the Marines had of having a good meal of real food and a shower were quickly dashed. The VIP which they were picking up was adamant about leaving immediately. Lieutenant Gabriel and the Helios pilot, Warrant Officer Nasri, exited the gunship to meet the VIP as soon as they landed, while the rest of the 4th Platoon Marines sat fuming inside of the cargo bay. Even Lieutenant Gabriel was slightly annoyed, wondering what was so important that he didn't even have a chance to grab a mug of real coffee from one of the Star Docks mess halls. 15 minutes after arriving, the Helios gunship was back in open space, headed towards the assault carrier USS Kitty Hawk. When Lieutenant Gabriel entered the hatch to the cargo bay, his Marines came to attention, all wearing the cleanest duty uniforms they could find. "At ease, Marines," said Lieutenant Gabriel, stepping aside to allow the VIP to enter. The VIP ended up being a young lady in her mid-20s. She was dressed in a tight-fitting, elegant designer white pantsuit combination with matching designer heels. She had a somewhat long face with a nose that seemed a bit too large for her face and thin lips which barely covered a noticeably large overbite. Her wavy brown hair, usually done up glamorously, sat listlessly to her shoulders, but her eyes were a striking blue. "Marines," said Lieutenant Gabriel, "this is Miss Seashell Killari, daughter of Senator William J. Killari. She's on an important diplomatic mission, which is why we need to leave Belmore Station in a hurry." Lieutenant Gabriel stepped aside, allowing the senator's daughter to enter the cargo bay. "I apologize for the austere accommodations, Miss Killari, but we've rearranged the gunship weapon containers to form a separate space so that you can have your own privacy. We've also set up a couple of cots inside the space for you." Then, turning to his platoon, Gabriel said, "Marines, let's get Miss Killari's baggage inside the bay." She wrinkled her nose and looked with barely disguised contempt at the Marines, who were still standing at parade rest. "Oh my God, do you people even bathe? This place smells like a barn." "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am," said Staff Sergeant Talley. "Well, we've been on a mission for almost 2 weeks and this gunship doesn't have shower facilities. We apologize for the ascent." Staff Sergeant Talley raised her eyebrows, wondering what Seashell Killari was talking about, since Tally didn't smell anything unusual. "Oh, I know all about your so-called mission," said Killari. "It was all over the GNN vid feeds a couple of hours ago. You people nuked an innocent research freighter simply because they found something that you gun-toting Neanderthals didn't understand." The Marines gave her a sharp look, but said nothing as Lieutenant Gabriel pierced them all with a stern gaze. Inwardly, Gabriel groaned. Galactic News Network, he thought to himself. All the slanted opinion pieces that were fit to broadcast. Gotta love 'em. Gabriel cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. We've made your area as large and spacious as we could, and there's plenty of space for your baggage. We'll try not to bother you for the duration of your trip to the kiddie hall." "Is this some kind of joke?" snapped Killary. "I'm not staying in some dank, musty-smelling hole with a bunch of trained psychopathic murderers. I'm on a diplomatic mission of peace and understanding, something you gun-toting army lunatics know nothing about." "Gun-toting marine lunatics, ma'am," said PFC Chansey. Lieutenant Gabriel shot Chansey an angry look, gritting his teeth at her as Chansey tried to suppress a smile. "Marines, Army, whatever. You're all fucking barbarians, and I refuse to spend the entirety of this trip trapped like an animal with you. God, you animals!" screamed Killary. "That's why my father is working hard to pass legislation to defund you people. Murdering animals don't need guns. Where's the VIP executive suite?" "Ma'am," said Lieutenant Gabriel, suddenly thinking that the mutated human demons on the CSCS Mont Caparo might have been better company. "This is a Helios-class Marine Corps gunship. It doesn't come equipped with a VIP executive suite." "Fine, then I'm going to sit in the cockpit," Killary said as she pushed past the 3 Marines carrying her extensive amount of personal baggage into the cargo bay. "Don't touch my stuff," she yelled as her high heels clanged down the metal corridor towards the cockpit. "If I find any of my things missing, I'll have my father fire you." "Think she has any real food in her baggage?" said Corporal Palkovich, a team leader in 3rd Squad who was hauling 2 of Seashell Killary's gigantic suitcases into the bay. "Shut up and get the rest of her shit in here," said Sergeant Hernandez, Palkovich's squad leader. Lieutenant Gabriel hit an intercom button on the bulkhead next to the hatch and spoke into the wall-mounted speaker. "Heads up, cockpit. Miss Seashell Killary is on her way there." "We heard, Lieutenant," replied Warrant Officer Nasri with all the enthusiasm of watching paint dry. "Roger," said Lieutenant Gabriel. "Be advised that we are locking the hatch behind her. Have a nice flight." "Asshole," said Nasri. As Miss Seashell Killary insisted on sitting in the cockpit, the ship's gunner ended up going back to the cargo bay with the rest of 4th Platoon, while the Senator's daughter took the gunner's seat. 2 hours later, Gabriel flicked on the intercom to eavesdrop on what was going on in the cockpit, and could hear Seashell complaining to the pilot about how the military are nothing but tools for the corrupt government to oppress the minorities in the outer ring colonies, and how Willow's World, which was her final destination, would hopefully be the start of a galactic uprising to bring about galactic social awareness and galactic social justice. He shut off the intercom, took a nap, and turned it on again 2 hours later. He could hear Seashell still complaining, this time about how it was going to take some kind of universal social awakening before the rest of the galaxy realized that the lives of the minorities working on the resort planets mattered. He shut off the intercom again, but 2 hours later, Warrant Officer Jennifer Nasri, the gunship's pilot, turned on the intercom. "Gabriel, you there?" she whispered. "Yeah, I'm here, Jen," Gabriel answered. "Go secure," said the pilot. Gabriel unhooked a headset from a recessed side panel and connected it into the wall-mounted jack underneath the intercom so that he could talk privately with the pilot. He could hear Miss Killary in the cockpit snoring in the background. "I am seriously gonna launch this bitch into space," whispered Nasri. "She's fucking gassing up my cockpit. What do these rich debutantes eat anyway? You owe me big time for letting her sit up here, mister." Lieutenant Gabriel looked around, making sure none of his Marines could hear him. "Weekend in Vegas," he said. "Screw that," said Nasri. "Earth is a shithole, you cheap ass. You just made first lieutenant, so you can afford better. Make it a week in Vegas and I might think about forgiving you." "Yep," said Gabriel. "Love you too." "Promises, promises," said Nasri. The rest of the flight to the assault carrier USS Kitty Hawk went relatively uneventfully. When the Marines got too restless, Sergeant Hernandez and Private First Class Chensi conducted combatives and martial arts combat training for the platoon to keep them sharp on their hand-to-hand combat tactics, but mostly just to burn off excess energy. The bay was just barely long enough so that the Marines could set up a digitized bore scoping range where they could calibrate their weapons after they cleaned and reassembled them, and Lieutenant Gabriel was even able to lead 4th Platoon in a little bit of physical fitness training before Miss Seashell Killery stormed down to the cargo bay, complaining that Marines were making so much noise that they were seriously interfering with her open-mind sensory mojo meditation. She complained that if she didn't get at least 2 hours of meditation a day, her open mind would be adversely affected, causing her mojo to descend into the 3rd house of Uranus, and that the Marines would be awake to this type of astro-spiritual enlightenment if they would learn to read a book instead of color them in. Finally, after what seemed like a week to the 4th Platoon Marines, it was only about a day and a half, the Helios gunship docked on the assault carrier USS Kitty Hawk. The Kitty Hawk was the 9th naval vessel to bear the name and, as an assault carrier, carried 1 squadron of 14 aerospace superiority fighters, 1 squadron of 14 multi-role aerospace fighters, and 2 squadrons of 16 Helios gunships. She was smaller than a regular Triumph-class carrier, which could carry twice as many fighter squadrons, but the Kitty Hawk was as fast and more heavily armored and carried the armament of a battle cruiser. A civilian Saab Lear-class shuttle was already docked in the hangar bay awaiting Miss Seashell Killari, who was all too eager to get away from all these toxic warmongering, baby-killing idiots in uniform. She stormed off the Helios back ramp, yelling behind her to the Marine Corps goons to be careful with her baggage, reminding them that if even one of her Imagine Galactic Peace buttons was missing from one of her baggages, there would be hell to pay. For their part, the Marines were more than happy to help Miss Killery move her things to her awaiting shuttle, which, no doubt, had an executive VIP suite. Gabriel's Marines were just glad that a long mission, which capped off a long deployment, was coming to a close, that a few months of well-deserved rest and recuperation awaited them before they'd be expected to head out into space again. A tall, skinny young man with dark, wavy brown hair emerged from the civilian shuttle and hugged Seashell, looking derisively at Lance Corporal Chapman, Private First Class Chensi, and Corporal Palkovich, as they hauled all of Seashell's baggage into the luxurious VIP shuttle. As they hugged, Seashell regaled the tall young man with stories about how she put the Marines in their place when they harassed her and attempted to steal her belongings during the trip from Beltmore Station. Having stacked all 12 of Seashell's large baggages into the cargo hold, the 3 Marines debarked the luxurious civilian shuttle to rejoin the rest of their comrades, who were unloading the Helios gunship. The skinny young man turned, angrily yelling to the Marines to stop. Looking at each other, Chapman, Chensi, and Palkovich stopped and turned to walk back to where Seashell and her tall gentleman friend were standing. "What's up, buddy?" said Palkovich. "Buddy? Buddy?" the young man said in an overly aggressive and offended voice. He puffed himself up, looking to Seashell for reassurance. She smiled and nodded approvingly. "It looks like someone needs to show you jarheads a little manners." The young man sized up the 3 Marines. Chapman and Palkovich were males, both standing 6 feet, lean and muscular like most of the warriors who served in the Corps. PFC Chensi was female, about 5'4" and Asian. The civilian man grabbed Private First Class Chensi by her uniform collar and attempted to lift her off her feet. "You're going down, jarhead." Now Chensi, a junior martial arts combatives instructor, grabbed one of the young man's wrists, stepping behind him while at the same time kicking the back of his knee. As the young man went down, Chensey rode him to the deck, pushing on his shoulder with her right arm while twisting his wrist behind him with her left. Quickly she had her boot in the middle of his back, while now applying pressure to his left wrist with both of her hands. The young man screeched, yelling, "She attacked me! She attacked me! Get her off me!" 4 private security service bodyguards, each wearing black tactical military-type uniforms, raced from the shuttle to his side, ordering PFC Chensey to step away. Chapman and Palkovich stepped in between Chensey and the 4 bodyguards as more 4th Platoon Marines came running from the gunship. "Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am?" yelled the young man, his face planted on the deck of the hangar, Chensey's combat boot just inches below his neck. "I'm Hunter Hiding. Hunter Hiding, you bitch. I'm former Vice President Hiding's son." Chesney looked down at the arrogant young man who had just put his hands on her. Hunter Hiding, if he was upright, would have stood almost a foot taller than her. "Do you know who I am?" she said. "No," said the former vice president's son. "Good," she said. "Then I don't know which high-ranking politician's asshole son just put his hands on me." She let up on the pressure, throwing Hunter's arm down beside him. "Come on, guys," she said as she walked away. Chapman and Palkovich turned to follow her back to the gunship. "Get her! Get her!" yelled Hiding to the private security detachment. He stood up, brushing off his clothes and puffing out his chest once again. I don't think that's a good idea, Mr. Hiding," said one of the security officers. "Not with so many people witnessing you putting your hands on that female Marine." The big security bodyguard looked nervously around. About 3 dozen Marines and fleet personnel had surrounded them at a respectable distance, unmoving, but the looks on their faces said that a privileged, spoiled civilian attacking a small female Marine on a naval assault carrier was a very bad idea. "Besides, we have a narrow margin to meet if we're going to rendezvous with the CSNS Newcastle on time and get to Willow's World," continued the bodyguard. Hunter Hiding put his hands on his waist, looking around at the Marines and the naval personnel in the hangar deck who were staring back at him. He straightened up his collar and yelled loud enough so that everyone could hear. "Yeah, because we have a real mission do you hear? Not some bullying mission where a bunch of cowardly gun nuts blow up a helpless scientific research vessel." He then turned and pointed like a commanding general at PFC Chensey. "I'll see you again, you bitch. You hear me? I'll see you again." Chensey scratched the back of her neck with her middle finger as she walked away. Seashell clapped. "Oh, Hunter, you're so brave to stand up to those baby killers like that." Lieutenant Gabriel and Warrant Officer Nasri were standing outside the cockpit of the gunship. Gabriel had made to run to the civilian shuttle when he saw the tall, lanky civilian put his hands on one of his Marines, but Warrant Officer Nasri put out her hand and stopped him. Gabriel stood, hands on hips, and stared at Private First Class Chensey as she approached with Chapman and Palkovich following close behind her. Chensey looked down, guilt written all over her face. Part 2. "Private First Class Ichiro Chensey," said Lieutenant Gabriel, in a tone sounding like a father getting ready to scold a disobedient child. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but that jerk—" "Good job, Chensey," Gabriel said in a whisper. "Now do you think you can help the rest of the platoon unload our stuff without breaking off someone's arm?" "I'll try," Chensey said as she raced around the gunship to where the main hatch opened into the cargo bay and where her platoon was offloading equipment, weapons, and ammunition. Lieutenant Gabriel looked to see Chapman and Palkovich standing awkwardly there, staring dumbly at him and Warrant Officer Nasri. It was no secret in the platoon that Gabrielle and Nasri had the hots for each other. "What the hell are you two clowns looking at?" said Gabriel. Said Palkovich. "We just—" stammered Chapman. "Palkovich, Chapman," yelled Sergeant Hernandez, sticking his head around the back of the gunship. Get your asses back here and help us unload these damn 35 migrants. Hooah, Sergeant, the two Marines said, almost gratefully as they ran around to the other side of the gunship. So, said Warrant Officer Nasri, finally removing her flight helmet and shaking her head to let her red hair fall down past her shoulders. She smelled like body odor and sweat, but Gabriel didn't mind. He probably smelled worse. 2 weeks in Vegas once we get back to San Diego Orbital Naval Base. Wait, what? Said Gabriel. I thought you said 1 week. Sam, she said, have you smelled the inside of that damn cockpit? Geez, that VIP that you saddled me with blew up the whole place when she slept. I mean, she played her ass trumpet like a champ. And now my personal battle space smells like caviar, boiled eggs, and high society. It's going to take a week just to air out my gunship. No, 2 weeks, mister. Gabriel held up his hands in surrender. I'll see what I can do, Jen, he said. Yeah, promises, said Warrant Officer Jennifer Nasri as she rolled her eyes. Then, turning, she yelled to the rest of the gunship crew. Let's get it refueled and reloaded, and call maintenance up here to get the -20 and -30 level checks done, and, for God's sake, someone open the window slats in the cockpit. The hangar bay was abuzz with organized chaos as Marine platoons left the carrier aboard Helios gunships on missions, while other Marine platoons, such as the 4th Platoon, returned from missions. Meanwhile, maintenance and refueling operations were being conducted on squadrons of aerospace fighters, while yet other fighters were being launched above decks for escort and patrol missions. Although the USS Kitty Hawk had only 1 week left on station before heading back to the San Diego Orbital Base, it didn't mean that her operational tempo was going to slack off. The Kitty Hawk's crews would be busy almost until the hour she was scheduled to leave station, to be replaced by the assault carrier USS Ranger. Lieutenant Gabriel watched Jennifer disappear into the hold of her gunship, talking with the maintenance chief about an issue with 2 of the gunship's starboard maneuvering thruster control links. He walked around to the back of the gunship, pulling Staff Sergeant Boyer aside and telling his first squad leader that he'd be in charge of the platoon while he went to brief the Delta Company commander on their mission. He instructed Boyer to make sure that the platoon got fed and showered after the squad and team leaders ensured that all the equipment was clean and serviceable, and function checks were conducted on all the weapons and turned into the company's arms room. He also wanted all ammunition accounted for, and called for all NCOs to be in the company conference room in 2 hours. By this time, post-mission activities were all routine for this well-oiled platoon of combat seasoned Marines, but Lieutenant Gabriel still had to go through the formality of telling Staff Sergeant Boyer what he expected during his absence. Boyer was smirking. What? Said Lieutenant Gabriel. My brother manages a hotel on the Vegas Strip. Boyer's thin mustache curled up like a smiley face. I can get you and Warrant Officer Nasri a good deal on a room when we get back. Shut up, said Gabriel, laughing. He turned and left the hangar, knowing that his platoon was in good hands, and stepped through a hatch which would lead down to a lower desk where the 2 companies of Marines were housed. We didn't even notice when the VIP's fancy civilian Saab Lear shuttle took off. The commander of Delta Company was a short and stocky Marine named Captain Marco Sims, who liked his briefings just like he was, short, to the point, and with no bullshit. He'd been Delta Company commander for the past 2.5 years, and was up for promotion to major once this deployment was over. Lieutenant Gabriel liked Captain Sims, as he was one of those rare commanders who never micromanaged his company and trusted his platoon leaders to actually lead their Marines with minimal supervision, but with maximum command support. I'm not gonna shit you, Sam, said Captain Sims. The Vice President's son and Senator Hillary daughter are threatening to bring you up on war crimes accusations for destroying the Mont Cabaru. But the vid card feeds which you sent back, along with the final vid feeds we received from the crew of the Mont Cabaru, before they all morphed into real-life Hells Angels, more than support your initial reports of what happened during your mission. You have my full support as well as the support of the detachment commander and the commander of the K-Hawk. Hell, even Fleet Command will vouch that you'd fully follow the rules of engagement for this type of incident. no good deed goes unpunished, sir, said Gabriel, finally taking a sip of real coffee that he'd snagged from the galley. Yeah, agreed Captain Sims. But expect them to file some kind of complaint after their little jaunt to Willow's World is complete, especially since little Chancy put the former VP son down on the deck. Again, it probably won't go anywhere, but it will more than likely show up on your fit rep when you come up for promotion. Lieutenant Gabriel shook his head, wondering how bad it would really have been if Jennifer had actually ejected Senator Killery's daughter into space. He closed his eyes, trying but failing to remove such an unprofessional thought from his head. Willow's World, he said instead. Yeah, apparently there's some local disturbance there, and the popular narrative that's being broadcast on our favorite galactic news network is that the colonists are protesting against the president's oppressive and racist policies against the Outer Ring colonies. Well, the former vice president and Senator Killery are looking to unseat the president in the fall, so they sent their kids to Willow's World to address their issues against President Helania, so that they can use it to hurt her in the elections. Gotta love politicians, said Lieutenant Gabriel, remembering something Hunter Hiding said about his father wanting to defund the military. Create the narrative, then set out to prove the narrative's true. I'm glad we aren't part of that circus sideshow. Same here, said Captain Sims. I'd almost rather turn down my promotion to Major and forego shore duty at some Earth base to stay deployed out here in space where we're safe from all that political bullshit. Oh, I'll drink to that, sir, said Gabriel, raising his cup of coffee to his commander. Anyway, Sam, good job, said Captain Sims. You completed the mission and brought all your Marines home. Can't say the same for Golf Company's first platoon. What happened with them? Asked Gabriel, remembering that he and the Golf Company first platoon leader graduated OCS together in Quantico. Well, they were doing initial recon on WNR-019C, a Class 1 low-grav planet. 67% of the Earth's gravity, dense jungle, lots of indigenous wildlife, floating mountains, that kind of shit, said Captain Sims. They were using hover packs and were floating about 30 feet above the jungle canopy, doing aerial mapping of terrain features, and they came across a long and wide canyon. The canyon was deep and dropped into darkness. Hidden motion sensors indicated a mass of life forms were living down in that canyon, but the platoon leader still ordered his Marines to jet across as their LZ was 10 clicks to the east of the current location. While the Marines were still floating about 30 feet above the canyon, their hover packs taking almost 20 seconds to cover the 200-meter wide gap when, suddenly, the heat and motion sensors indicated that the mass of life forms inside the canyon was rising. Most of the platoon had already made it across to the other side, but something thin, pink, sticky, and long had suddenly shot up from the canyon and wrapped itself around the Marine who was tail-end Charlie of the platoon, and yanked her down into the darkness. While the rest of the platoon began unloading at whatever it was that was climbing out of the canyon. It wasn't a mass of life forms, but one giant one. Well, their vidcam showed what looked to be some kind of giant red dinosaur-looking iguana dragon, about 80 feet long. It still had half of the dead Marine in its mouth. Well, anyway, they hit the thing with their 20mm canyon and 35mm auto grenades until it toppled back into the canyon, but all that firing had stirred up a bunch of long-necked flying alligator things with web wings which flew out of the canyon. The Marines had to land to avoid being bitten by the damn things and hump the remaining 10 clicks to the clearing where their gunship could land and extract them. They returned to the K-Hog 2 days ago, concluded Captain Sims. Do we know the Marine's name who died? Said Gabriel. Private Melly, said Sims. Brand new. Just graduated Paris Island a few months ago. It's her first deployment. Anyway, since we only lost one Marine during the initial recon, the big global corporations will more than likely want to begin research, colonization, and exploitation efforts within the next year or two on planet WNR-019C. Gabriel nodded, glad that he did not know a Private Melly. When he had the chance, he'd make his way to Golf Company's area and offer his condolences to his friend. He knew from experience that it was hard for a new platoon leader to lose a Marine. Anyway, continued Captain Sims. First and third platoons will be returning from their missions sometime within the next 48 to 72 hours, and second will be back sometime after that. Your fourth platoon has downtime for the next 48 hours, after which fourth platoon will be the ready platoon should any other mission come along. I'll have either first or third relieve you afterwards. Although this close to us leaving the station, I don't expect that we'll be handling any more missions. In the meantime, get some rest and see about reserving your vacation in Vegas. It's the tourist season, so you'll need to get 'em in early. Good to go, sir, said Lieutenant Gabriel, coming to attention and saluting his commander, all the while wondering if there wasn't anyone on the US Kitty Hawk that didn't know about him and Warrant Officer Nasri. He had enough time to take a long, hot shower and get dressed in a clean set of duty uniforms, before heading down to the galley for a sandwich and another mug of coffee. Refilling his mug again, he strolled back into the Delta Company conference room, where he had his debriefing with the commander earlier. As expected, his 3 squad leaders, Staff Sergeant Talley, Staff Sergeant Boyer, and Sergeant Hernandez, were there along with team leaders Sergeant Barlow and Corporal Hatcher of 1st Squad, Corporal Coddle, and Corporal Parker of 2nd Squad, and Sergeant Watson and Corporal Palkovich of 3rd Squad. Although corporals weren't officially considered NCOs, they were still given the duties of NCOs, and Lieutenant Gabriel felt that it was important that his corporals also attended his NCO leader meetings, as it gave them more experience and insight into their duties once they finally advanced in rank to become actual sergeants. Setting his subordinates up for success in the Corps was a big thing for Lieutenant Gabriel, and his corporals appreciated him for it, although it did mean that they had less downtime than the lower-ranking Marines. After getting confirmation from his first-line leaders that all gear had been serviced, cleaned and stowed, and damaged or non-mission-capable equipment had been turned into supply, Gabriel debriefed his Marines on the mission which they'd just undertaken, congratulating them on a near-textbook operation. He then conducted a detailed after-action review, or AAR, going over every action that each team and each squad and each individual Marine had taken in order to examine what went right, what went wrong, and what could have been improved upon for later subsequent missions. Gabriel never rushed his AARs, and took extensive notes on the opinions and suggestions from his NCOs in order to incorporate them into future training scenarios. He then briefed his NCOs on the loss of the Marine in Gulf Company, encouraging his Marines to go over and give their condolences and support their sister company in the tradition of esprit de corps, which made the Marine Corps unique among all other branches of service. Finally, he informed his first-line leaders that they were off duty for the next 48 hours, and to relax and decompress, as they should be the ready platoon after their 48-hour downtime was over. However, seeing as they were so close to leaving station, this was likely their last mission of the deployment. Congratulating them once again on a job well done throughout the last 15 months, he gave his NCOs one last assignment to submit the recommendation paperwork for their subordinates to receive awards and honors. In particular, he wanted to submit little Private First Class Chensi a recommendation for award, as she literally ran her flame gun dry holding off the mutated human creatures at a particularly narrow corridor inside Mont Cabaru as they made their withdrawal to the airlock. Not a bad feat considering Chensi wasn't even of legal age to drink yet. The briefing lasted close to 2 hours before Lieutenant Gabriel finally released his first-line leaders for the day. Usually he was loath to keep them so long, but seeing as this would likely be his last briefing with them before the K-Hawk made its way back to Earth, he felt it was appropriate. Once the Kitty Hawk entered hyperspace, his Marines would have next to nothing to do for the next 6 days until the carrier came out of hyperspace around Uranus's orbital path, after which the Kitty Hawk would basically coast for the next day or so, while her reverse thrusting engines slowed her speed until the assault carrier finally reached Earth orbit. Lieutenant Gabriel ascended up one level to where the Marine officers' quarters were located. Though his quarters were still cramped, he had considerably more space than his enlisted Marines, who usually slept 6 or 7 to a bay. He shared his quarters with one other Marine officer, a gunship pilot who was currently out on mission with 2nd Platoon, Delta Company, and not scheduled to return for at least 3 to 5 days. Finally, alone for the first time in almost 2 weeks, Gabriel again fished out his data pad from his rucksack and racked his head on how to submit his report without sounding like he wrote it in crayon. Of all the myriad subjects which he excelled at during OCS and the Marine Corps Advanced Infantry Space Terrestrial Combat Leadership course, report writing was his kryptonite. After about 3 minutes, he was fast asleep. Lieutenant Samuel Gabriel to the Tactical Operations Center. Lieutenant Gabriel to the TOC, came a robotic-sounding voice over the ship's internal comm system, which echoed down the Marine barracks area and inside Lieutenant Gabriel's quarters. Gabriel's brain said, "Oh shit," before he became fully awake. It had been 5 days since his 4th platoon returned to the USS Kitty Hawk from their mission, and only 48 hours before the K-Hawk was to leave station. The USS Ranger had already arrived on station 3 days ago, cruising 30 clicks off of the K-Hawk's starboard side as the K-Hawk's crew conducted the battle handoff to the newly arrived assault carrier. 48 hours. The powers that be couldn't give 4th Platoon 48 freaking hours before something called, needing his Marines to save their asses from space boogeyman. But to be fair, 1st and 3rd Platoons had only returned 2 days ago, so they were still technically on their 48-hour downtime, while 2nd Platoon returned to the K-Hawk just 10 hours ago. Gabriel's roommate, the gunship pilot working with the 2nd Platoon, was in his rack, snoring. Groaning, Lieutenant Gabriel rolled out of his rack and pulled on his duty uniform top. He considered getting in a quick shave, but decided against it and quickly made his way to the TOC, which was several levels above where the Marines were staying, in a part of the assault carrier's superstructure that overlooked the flat top's hangar deck and fighter launch platforms. He entered the very well-lit Tactical Operations Center with its 3D navigational tactical maps of the rim worlds, galactic positioning and tracking matrix of all spaceborne traffic lanes and hyperspace jump points, as well as countless other data streams which were projected on monitors and computer screens and watched over by dozens of fleet personnel. On the large conference table that was the centerpiece of the TOC, a 3D image of a planet was suspended over a circular projector in the middle of the table. At the table, studying the rotating planetary image, was not only Captain Sims, the Delta Company commander, but also Major Halfaker, the Marine Battalion's detachment commander, as well as Captain Von Luck, the USS Kitty Hawk's commanding officer, and Rear Admiral Hipper, the Naval Fleet commanding officer, as well as several other officers who outranked Lieutenant Gabriel. Immediately he regretted not getting a shave, but still entered the TOC as if he owned it. He came to attention and offered a sharp salute to the assembled officers, but faced Rear Admiral Hopper, the senior ranking officer. Lieutenant Gabriel, 4th Platoon Delta, reporting as ordered.
"At ease, Lieutenant Gabriel," said Rear Admiral Hipper. "Thank you so much for quickly coming. Please step up to the conference table. I apologize for calling you. I know you and your Marines have just come off a mission, but this developing situation is critical."
"No need to apologize, sir. That's what the Marines are here for." Lieutenant Gabriel approached the conference table, nodding to Captain Sims and Major Halfaker, who, in return, nodded back. He studied the 3D projection of the rotating planet displayed hovering 2 feet above the table. The illuminated data plaque projected underneath the planet read, Planet BHO 666A, Class 1, Atmosphere, breathable, no external tanks required, gravity 0.982% less than Earth. And Gabriel's heart sank when he read the planet's name. Name designation, Willow's World.
"Commander Dixon,"
said Admiral Hipper, turning to a slender female naval officer whose light brown hair was tied in a tight bun behind her head,
"could you please give us a brief rundown on the latest history of planet BHO 666A, called Willow's World?"
"Yes, Admiral," Commander Dixon, the naval intelligence officer, began. "Planet BHO 666A, named Willow's World after the astrophysicist Carter Willow, who discovered it while charting the rim worlds a decade ago,
was finally colonized 8 months ago when the colonizer ship CSNS Sydney Point reported that she was in orbit around the planet and was preparing to make planetfall. Like all Magellan-class colonizer ships, the Sydney Point is large, roughly the size of one of our Triumph-class carriers, and holds approximately 6,000 colonists and crew, along with equipment, vehicles, terraforming modules, and construction materials to begin building a viable and profitable colony. Before descending, the CSNS reported a slight anomaly on the planet's surface, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and there were no distress or alert beacons which followed. That was the last transmission we received from the Sydney Point. We've not heard from the Willow's World colony since then, and they've missed their monthly status reports back to Earth. This is not unusual, as we have very few retrans satellites out in the rim worlds. So, while rare, it's not beyond the norm for colonizer transmissions to not reach Earth for months after their broadcast. For instance, Sophia colony was dark for 2.5 months before we received word that their colony was up and running, and Beltmore 6 was dark for 3 months before we got word that they were progressing nicely. But 8 months is a long time for a colonizer ship to go dark, said Lieutenant Gabriel. Agreed, said Commander Dixon. It is. We assume it may be because of some atmospheric or solar interference which may be hampering any communications. Plus, we do not have any retrans satellites in that sector, so a transmission from Willow's World will likely take longer than usual to be received. So we'll be doing sort of a health and welfare inspection for the Willow World colony, said Gabriel. Well, not exactly, said Admiral Hipper. I mean, your mission is to ascertain the status of the colonists there, but your platoon's main focus will be asset recovery.
Sir, said Gabriel.
Another naval commander, this one the chief operations officer, spoke up.
About 6 hours ago, we picked up the following transmission from the CSNS Newcastle in orbit around Willow's World. That's the luxury starliner which brought Vice President Hiding's son and Senator Killery's daughter to the planet.
Take a listen, he said, signaling a comms technician to replay the transmission.
A garbled and heavily static noise filled the room, with warbling that increased and decreased in pitch and tone.
Lieutenant Gabriel tilted his head, trying to make out any voices in the sea of static and interference which sounded like electrical ocean waves crashing on shore. Suddenly, a frantic male voice came over the speakers.
I'd made CS Newcastle being landed fall. Mayday.
Lieutenant Gabriel leaned back, crossing his arms in contemplation.
Sounds like the CSNS Newcastle sent out a mayday while in orbit above Willow's World.
The speaker used the word being, meaning that something external had happened to the ship. And, did I hear the words planetfall?
Well, that's what we think we heard as well, said Major Halfacre. But the CSNS Newcastle wasn't designed for planet-side landings, as it doesn't have landing struts. They have landers, but we aren't sure if they launched to the surface.
Maybe the Newcastle landed in a body of water, Gabriel speculated.
Possible, said Admiral Hipper. We don't know for sure. Hell, for all we know, the Willow colony actually did rebel against the government and shot down the Newcastle. We just don't know. That's why we're sending your Marines to find out.
In less than an hour, 4th Platoon Delta was back aboard their Helios gunship, headed for a rendezvous with the USS Galveston City, a long-ranger-class corvette built for high endurance and speed, which the fleet used for long-range patrols and escort duties. The corvette had a small hangar bay which could only just accommodate the Marines' gunship, and Lieutenant Gabriel addressed his platoon as they sat beside their gunship.
So we lost contact with the ship that brought the Vice President Hiding's son and Senator Killery's daughter to Willow's World, he began. They were in orbit around the planet when they sent a distress signal saying, we assume, that they were making planetfall.
Did the colonists attack them? Asked Staff Sergeant Tully. Maybe Seashell Killery was right after all, and the colonists did actually rebel against the government.
Well, that is one of many assumptions and possibilities which we are being dispatched to find out. Although the equipment manifest of the colonizer vessel does not include surface-to-space weaponry, still, if the colonizers do prove to be hostile, our rules of engagement are not to engage if at all possible. Our overarching objective is to secure Miss Seashell Killery and Mr. Hunter Hiding, along with the other occupants of the CSNS Newcastle, and return them to Earth.
What was the manifest of the Newcastle, sir? Asked Staff Sergeant Boyer.
Lieutenant Gabriel pulled out his data pad and scrolled to the mission objectives, which the operations officer had downloaded. Okay, he said. The CSNS Newcastle had a complement of 22, including 16 ship's crew, the 4 hired security bodyguards, and the 2 VIPs from the opposition party sent to show solidarity with the colonists against the current administration. All those emissaries, of course, were Seashell Killery and Hunter Hiding. I'll send the mission and concept of operations to each of the squad leaders' data pads for you to study, including planetary specs and potential opposing force hostiles. As usual, we have very little to go on, so stay flexible and ready for anything. The Galveston City will be entering hyperspace in an hour or so let's make sure we've secured everything down and be in your assigned restraining seats in 30 mics. The trip to Willowswell will take about 3 days. The Kitty Hawk is going to stay on station until we return. The first 20 to 30 minutes of hyperspace travel is the hardest for the human body as the ship increases to beyond the speed of light. The restrictor seats basically keep the body still as face marks force feed oxygen into the lungs, while air bladders built in the seats expand and contract to assist in the flow of blood to the rest of the body. Once the ship reaches its light cruising speed, the ship's internal gravity compensators kick in, adjusting for forward velocity and inertia. It takes the average person roughly 15 to 30 minutes to get over the vertigo feeling, but they usually recover with no significant after effects. Once the compensators activate, the Marines were basically free to move about the ship until it was time to emerge from hyperspace, when the process of securing the restrictor seats is repeated again while the ship decelerated into real space. Outside, the bulkhead port windows shone with a brilliant bright white, as all of the stars in the galaxy merged into one color as they zoomed past at incredible speeds as the Corvette reached light cruising speed. There was a small galley in the Corvette, and most of the Marines spent the next 3 days eating, cleaning, and servicing their weapons, playing virtual games, or sleeping. PFC House's classical movie collection was fast becoming popular with his fellow young Marines, and they watched over and over with great fascination a vintage Marine Corps training video called Full Metal Jacket, which showed the arcane ritual of ancient Marine Corps recruits murdering their drill instructors at the end of each training cycle. If modern-day Marines were tough, they were nothing compared to the Marines of the 1960s. Now, for his part, Lieutenant Gabriel kept playing possible scenarios over and over again in his head. There was something that didn't add up in this mission, but then again, nothing ever did add up when you had absolutely no idea what you were heading into. The crew of the CSNS Sydney Point, the colonizer ship that originally landed on Willowswell, had said something about an anomaly on the planet's surface before it attempted to planetfall. After that, all comms were lost with the ship. The opposing party emissaries, led by Hunter Hiding and Seashell Killery, then travelled to the planet on a goodwill mission, assuming that all was well and the communications blackout was simply the result of the colonists staging a revolt against a president that was disliked immensely by her political rivals. Now, that was a very big jump in logic to take, but logic wasn't really what you should expect from politicians who desperately wanted to win an election. The popular political narrative was that the colonists of Willowswell were staging a protest against the alleged president's racism and bigotry against the Outer Rim worlds, and, come hell or high water, the popular political narrative was going to be the truth, whether the truth liked it or not. 3 days later, the Marines unstrapped themselves from their restraining chairs, which lined both sides of the Corvette's bulkhead, with a second row of seats which ran down the middle. The porthole windows darkened again as the stars stopped zooming past and the galaxy began to look normal once again. Deceleration to real space has been achieved. came the static-sounding voice over the intercom of the corvette's commander. "Secure from hyperspace. We will continue deceleration in real space for the next 9 hours until we reach Willow's world orbit." Lieutenant Gabriel unstrapped quickly, ignoring the slight vertigo that racked his body as he stood up. "Squad leaders, give me a thumbs up when your squads are ready to go," he said as he exited the bay which contained the platoon's restraining chairs. Walking to the rear of the bay, he crossed over a hatch to a small metal landing which overlooked the hangar bay. Descending the metal stairs, he walked to the gunship sitting in the middle of the hangar. Warrant Officer Nasri, her navigator, and her gunner rode out the deceleration from hyperspace inside the gunship, as the padded seats in the cockpit were much more comfortable than the regular restrictor seats that the regular grunts had to strap into. By the time Gabriel got there, Jennifer and her crew were already up and performing post-hyperspace deceleration checks on the gunship, ensuring that it was mission-capable when the time came to drop into Willow's world. Gabriel caught up to Jennifer as she checked the actuating links of the 2 maneuvering thrusters which needed adjusting. "How do we look, Jen? We good?" "Nope," said Jennifer. She'd been in a foul mood ever since they left the kitty hall. "You're still mad the politicians wouldn't authorize you to upload any ordnance on the gunship," said Gabriel. "Not even one damned 35 mic round. We're a gunship. Hell, it's in the name. Gun. How the hell are we supposed to support you if we don't have anything to fire?" It was literally a last-second decision made by the politicians back on Earth. An hour before the Helios gunship left the K-Hawk to link up with the Galveston City, the civilian bigwigs half a galaxy away ordered that no ordnance was to be loaded on the gunship, to prevent unintended civilian casualties. The order was signed by Senator William J. Guillory himself. All ordnance had to be removed from the gunship, effectively making her a simple, unarmed transport. "Oh, our civilian overlords know best," said Gabriel. "Besides, you can still scout for us. We're the ones that will be boots on the ground," he said, trying and failing to sound optimistic. When out-of-touch civilian politicians dictated military operations from posh, air-conditioned offices light years away from where the danger was occurring, more Marines tended to feel bore body bags at the end of the mission. "This is bullshit, Sam," said Jennifer. "We never go into unknown situations with our hands tied behind our backs. It's crazy." "We can call for orbital fire support from the corvette," said Gabriel. "Well, if we have comms from the ground," said Jennifer. "Remember that both the Newcastle and the Sydney Point had communication issues once they reached orbit." "Then I'll use your gunship as a communication relay to the corvette," said Gabriel. The gunship pilot threw up her hands in frustration and rolled her eyes. Why the hell should a ground maneuver element need to use a gunship as radio retrans for orbital fire support when the gunship should have all the fire support right there ready to go? Plus, the gunship is only a few clicks away from the grunts we're supporting. The damn corvette's going to be in orbit. And that's why Gabriel loved Jen so much. She was a true Marine, dedicated and determined to support the grunts who were boots on the ground. She was passionate about getting in and helping her fellow warriors, no matter what type of damage her gunship may take. Ever since close air support was invented, Marine pilots were the best in the galaxy, and Jen had proven to be one of the best of the best. Gabriel pursed his lips, rubbing his chin in thought. Senator Guillory personally signed the order, saying that no ordnance was to be loaded on the gunship, he said. "Asshole," said Jennifer. "But I didn't see the order saying that ordnance couldn't be loaded inside the gunship," said Gabriel. Jennifer's eyes sparkled green as she smiled. 4 hours later, Lieutenant Gabriel, Warrant Officer Nasri, the corvette's commander, Lieutenant Commander Travis, and his chief ordnance officer, Lieutenant Sun Yi, were standing inside the cargo bay of the gunship. With all of the ordnance reload containers removed, there was plenty of space for their impromptu, though technically unauthorized, ordnance loadout. They stared down at 2 aluminum pallets, on which were securely strapped down 2 Mk-67 388mm torpedoes. They were an older model anti-shipping torpedo that was currently being replaced in the fleet by the more modern Mk-81, and the USS Galveston City had 16 of the older models in her arsenal. Fortunately, Fleet Command had ordered the USS Galveston to expand all of her Mk-67 torpedoes in live-fire training exercises prior to her returning to Earth, so that they could convert to the newer torpedoes.
Will this work?
Asked Warrant Officer Nasri.
Oh, it'll work,
said Lieutenant Sunye, the female ordnance officer.
We've removed the internal guidance systems and the primary and secondary propellant sources from these torpedoes and filled the space with additional explosives, in effect making each of these torpedoes a 350-pound dumb bomb. The fuses have been set to PD, or point detonating, but we've also installed secondary detonators that are set to go off 5 seconds after the ordnance leaves the gunship, or bomb ship as it were. You can use the retractable rollers in the cargo bay to roll the ordnance out of the back ramps, flying straight and level, but I would suggest you pitch up at an angle of at least 15 to 20 degrees before rolling them out to give yourself a greater measure of safety and accuracy.
Keep in mind, said Lieutenant Commander Travis, the corvette's commander, this isn't the most accurate way of ordnance delivery. Dropping dumb bombs out of the back of a gunship isn't the most optimal course of action. Remember that you'll have to calculate angle, trajectory, arc, wind speed, gravitational pull, and even then, weapon delivery on target will be tricky. I'd say any attempt to deliver the ordnance within 500 meters of friendly forces would be dangerously close. Warrant Officer Nasri nodded, looking at her weapons systems officer. Think you can handle those calculations, Aaron?
I'm from Kentucky, Second Lieutenant Aaron Vargas said. Windage is my specialty.
A few hours later, they'd assembled again on the bridge of the corvette. Gabriel also had his squad leaders with him, although that made the cramped bridge feel even tighter. But they needed to know what they were inserting into. The Galveston City was well within range to pick up Willow's World on long-range monitors, and Commander Travis had it pulled up and magnified on the large display screen. What they saw was a planet roughly 91% the size of Earth, which boasted green continents and bright blue seas which seemed to cover a third of the planet. White blankets of clouds floated lazily overhead, presenting the picture of an almost perfect-looking Class 1 planet. Life scans revealed a multitude of carbon-based organic life forms on the surface of the planet and in the seas, but there were no traces of radio signals or any other technologically produced communications. Well, this was troubling, as if the colony had successfully landed, or if Hiding or Hillry's ship were in the area, there would certainly have been some type of indication, even if the corvette's planet-scanning sensors weren't as powerful or sophisticated as her larger-class sister ships.
We have achieved orbit, sir, approximately 250 miles above her surface, announced the helmsman.
Very good, Lieutenant, said Travis. Keep us steady on this orbital trajectory. Let's do a few sensor passes before we commit to anything. A few moments passed as the lovely blue-green planet, so much like Earth, rotated serenely below. Suddenly, a chief petty officer monitoring the topographic scanners announced, "Sir, I've got an anomaly on what appears to be the northern continent, just above the planet's equator." "Put it on screen, please, Chief Morgan," said Commander Travis. A second screen appeared, overlaying the main viewing screen as Chief Morgan magnified what his sensor had picked up on the surface. In the middle of what appeared to be a lush, green, unspoiled landscape of rolling hills, mountains, and plains, sat a dark grey patch of land which seemed to be stamped right in the middle of its surroundings. This dark patch of land looked to resemble dead Earth, and was roughly circular in shape. "Diagnostics, Chief Morgan," said Commander Travis. "All sensor tests are green, sir," answered Chief Morgan. "That is no glitch. Whatever that anomaly is actually on the surface of the planet." "Helmsman," said Travis, "put us in geosynchronous orbit over the anomaly. Chief Morgan, magnify the anomaly to maximum." "Aye, sir," said Morgan. The dark anomaly increased on the monitor, now revealing the giant slabs of basalt-colored rock, deep crevices, and desolate canyons of the black, dead landscape. And ships. Dozens and dozens of derelict-looking ships of all sizes and shapes littered the ground for miles around and seemed to have been rotting on the surface of the planet for untold eons. Their destroyed hulking shells towered above the bleak and forlorn landscape. Whatever the ship's original colors were, they were all now black with age and covered in ash and soot, and displayed varying stages of decay. None of them seemed to be of human origin or of earthly design. There was a collective gasp in the bridge as Commander Travis said, "Chief, what is the area of land we're looking at?"
"Sir,"
said Chief Morgan, "this topographical anomaly is roughly 122 miles in diameter and—" "Hang on, sir."
"Sir, there seems to be some kind of slight energy spike coming from the exact center of the anomaly."
Part 3. "Realign and put it up on the monitor, Chief," ordered Travis. In the exact center of the circle of dead earth, the image of a black, horn-shaped structure seemed to spike out of a black rock mound and reached into the air. At the very tip of the structure, a growing orb of red light glowed.
"Sir," said an ensign at another console, "I'm picking up faint life signals about 5 miles south of that energy spike. It looks like the Newcastle."
"Overlay it on the screen, Ensign," said Travis, and immediately the mangled remains of what was unmistakably the CSNS Newcastle appeared on the main monitor. Warrant Officer Nasri turned to Lieutenant Gabriel, wondering how anyone could have survived that crash. The sleek luxury liner, which was roughly 85 meters long, seemed to have fallen straight down on top of a massive slab of rock which was jutting out of the ground. It was broken into 2 pieces, as if the rock had broken a spine.
"Ensign,"
said Lieutenant Gabriel, "you can pan right and up, roughly northeast of the Newcastle."
"Roger, sir,"
replied the ensign as he adjusted the long-range sensor camera in the direction which Lieutenant Gabriel had requested. The sensor monitor rested on the image of a starship which seemed to have crashed on the planet in the same fashion. It was broken into 3 pieces and seemed to be much newer than the other derelict ships which had met their weird fate on the surface of the planet.
"Focus, please, Ensign,"
said Commander Travis.
"Roger, sir. We're getting some type of atmospheric interference, but we should get a better visual, right about now." "Oh, good Lord."
There, sitting roughly 2 miles north of the Newcastle, sat the remains of the gigantic colonizer ship CSNS Sydney Point, which once housed 6,000 souls. Her once majestic and sleek lines, painted a bright white with stripes of bold reds and black, was now a rotting wreck of degrading ruin. Judging by the condition of the ship, it seemed to have been in that condition for almost a year. No sooner had the bridge crew aboard the USS Galveston City registered this than the glowing red orb which hovered above the black, horn-shaped structure expanded into a brilliant white light.
"Energy spike, sir,"
shouted Chief Morgan as a thin but blindingly brilliant beam of light shot from the horn-shaped structure, reaching with incredible speed through the atmosphere into space. The USS Galveston City lurched heavily from the force of the impact, which actually pushed the ship 2 miles beyond its geosynchronous orbit. Most of the crew were thrown to the deck as the corvette listed violently to port. Main power to the bridge shut off, and emergency generators kicked in as the warbling wail of warning sirens screamed. All of the bridge monitors and sensors went offline as main visual monitors turned to static. Wall and ceiling panels buckled and fell as electrical cables and wires fell around them like sparkling tentacles throughout the ship.
"Get internal comms back up,"
said Commander Travis as he climbed back into his chair. "Get me engineering." Lieutenant Gabriel had been knocked to the deck, along with the rest of his Marines, when the beam of light struck the corvette, but recovered quickly. He reached down and pulled Warrant Officer Nasri up off the ground, then quickly ran around to check on the rest of his squad leaders. Aside from a few minor bumps and bruises, his Marines were none the worse for wear. The Galveston city was purpose-built to be rugged in order to endure the ravages of long space patrols, and her internal compensators, which instantly adjusted the pressures to adapt to the sudden impact, no doubt saved many lives.
"There's an area of roughly 20 feet square at the bottom of the ship which has suffered some structural weakness," reported the chief engineer. "Structural integrity at that area is down to 87%.
"Can you put it on visual, Chief?" said Commander Travis.
"Working on it, sir,"
said Chief Morgan.
"Helmsman, I need you to right this ship. We're descending towards the planet," said Travis. "Roger, sir," said the helmsman. "Our main engines were briefly knocked offline, but they're coming up now. Our maneuver thrusters are at 91% now and rising."
"All divos."
"I need a casualty and damage report ASAP," said Commander Travis. "Chief Morgan, where's my visual?" "Up, sir," said Chief Morgan.
The main monitors blinked to life as Chief Morgan adjusted the external monitors to where the chief engineer said the structural weakness had occurred, focusing the cameras to a roughly 20-foot square area just aft of the ship between the Corvette's two main power thrusting engines and the lower main maneuvering wings. The image revealed a thin, reddish-white beam of light reaching up from the planet, which had attached itself to the ship. That thing's got us hooked, sir," said the helmsman.
"Like a tongue shooting up from a dark canyon to snatch a Marine out of the sky," thought Lieutenant Gabriel.
"Can we pull free, Ensign?" said Commander Travis, staring intently at the beam of light which had hold of his vessel.
"Negative, sir," said the helmsman. "Even with our maneuvering thrusters added to our main engine power, we're producing 0.086 less power than the force which is trying to pull us down to the planet."
"Engineering," said Travis into the ship's internal comms. "Can you give me more power?"
"Not much more, sir," replied the chief engineer. "We can maybe equalize the resisting force, but that'll only hold for a few hours before the engine strain will result in us bleeding off too much power. That thing has us hooked right under the reactor power core. If we try to overcompensate and pull away, we'd risk weakening the structural integrity even more on that section of the ship. And if that blows, we blow."
"About how much time do you calculate we have before the engine power goes critical?"
"About 3 hours, sir, if we try to equalize the pulling forces to stop our descent," replied the chief engineer. "After that, we drop like a rock."
"Engineering, this is Lieutenant Gabriel," yelled Gabriel into the intercom. "What if we keep engine power at the 0.086 power deficiency? How much time will we have then?"
"We'll be at a gradual degradation of our current orbit, Lieutenant," said the engineer. "We'll have about 8 hours of steady decline before the pull of gravity becomes too great and we drop out of the sky."
8 hours, said Gabriel, looking at his squad leaders. "I'll take 8 hours." "What do you have in mind, Lieutenant?" asked Commander Travis. "We'll take the gunship down to the planet, see if we can recover those VIPs, then attempt to neutralize that beam which is trying to reel us in. I figure if we give ourselves 2 hours to ingress and egress the area, we'll have 6 hours, give or take, to accomplish the mission. Hopefully there aren't many more of those beams down there, because if it snags us, it's going to be a real short mission." "All right," said Commander Travis. "Be advised that our comms are down, no doubt because of interference involving that damned anomaly, so we won't know if you are successful or not till we're released from that beam. We'll stay in our decaying orbit as long as we can, but when orbit becomes critical, I'll have to load the crew into the ejection boats. Hopefully, like you said, there aren't any more of those beams down there." In less than 10 minutes, the 42 Marines of 4th Platoon Delta were strapped into the canvas webbing that passed for seats along the cargo bulkhead of the gunship as Warrant Officer Nasri rocketed out of the Corvette's hangar bay. Initially, she moved on a perpendicular course away from the planet, using the bulk of the Corvette as a physical shield just in case another beam rose from the planet. After a few minutes, Nasri reversed course, pointing the nose of the gunship towards the planet, and applied full forward thrust, shooting the gunship under the bow of the Corvette zooming planetside. The navigator input the plot coordinates of the CSNS Newcastle into the nav telemetry computer of the gunship, calculating the fastest and most direct route to the down luxury cruiser. Hitting the right approach angle, Nasri gently eased the gunship into the upper atmosphere of Willow's world as the rugged ship's heat shields easily absorbed the incredible heat generated by the friction of planetfall. Once the gunship entered the thermosphere, the main thrusters shut off and power to the maneuvering thrusters engaged, which would gradually slow the ship's descent. In minutes, the gunship penetrated the planet's mesosphere, bucking in protest as the maneuvering thrusters fought against the pull of gravity.
"We should have unrestricted vision once we hit the atmosphere," said the navigator after they entered the stratosphere.
"High clouds, 14% chance of precipitation, 77-degree ambient temperature on the surface. We'll be breaching the lower stratosphere in 10, 9, 8. Up to now, Warrant Officer Nasri had just been trying to keep the descent as controlled as possible, as hundreds of computers made thousands of adjustments a second to keep the gunship from going into uncontrolled freefall. As they continued their rapid descent to the planet, she could feel the controls becoming more responsive. Off to her right, the view of a lush and beautiful planet greeted her. The clouds were high, the skies were blue, and the land masses were emblazoned with all shades of greens and browns, while to the north sat white land masses of polar ice, all the indications of the almost near perfect Class 1 planets. To her left, however, a swirling mass of black clouds over 100 miles in diameter circled over the geographic anomaly like a swarm of angry black locusts. As they penetrated the ozone layer and penetrated the troposphere, she could hear wicked bolts of lightning flashing above the clouds.
"What the hell?"
said Nasri. "That wasn't on the data telemetry earlier." With the descent from space to planetary atmosphere completed, the gunship's autopilot disengaged, returning flight controls to Nasri. At 44,000 feet, Nasri took control of the gunship, circling in a wide arc as the gunship descended. She looked in disbelief at the rolling mass of black clouds seeming to boil below them, while all around it, the vista was bright and clear. She stayed at the periphery of the storm clouds until, at 33,000 feet, her navigator announced, "Turn 447, Mach 686, Angels 120, begin decel to 340. "Roger," said Nasri, inputting the data into her guidance computer. A green HUD appeared before her with an image of the gunship superimposed on all available topographic and atmospheric data. A red crosshair appeared in front of the computerized image of the gunship, indicating that it was still on course as they entered the black cloud bank. There was a sudden jolt as the gunship was buffeted by the winds. "Hang on back there," yelled Nasri into the intercom. "It's going to get a bit bumpy until we get below these—"
"Shit," yelled the navigator. "I just lost all navigational telemetry."
Nasri could already see that her nav aids were showing nothing but static. "Geomap overlay?" she said.
"No good," said the navigator. "We're too far up. We'll have to descend lower."
"Okay," said Nasri. "Since we can't trust instruments, I'll have to take manual control." She looked outside the vision panels, seeing only grey and black clouds rushing by. "Hopefully we'll at least be right side up when we break cloud cover," Nasri yelled. She held the gunship as steady as she could, fighting the buffeting turbulence which threatened to flip them over, if they weren't flipped over already. In minutes, the navigator said, "I'm getting some topographical readings. We're about 20,000 feet. Lots of ground clutter." As they got closer to the ground, the denser air made the gunship easier to control, and Nasri eased up on the controls, slowing their descent. They were still inside the thick cloud banks, and visibility was still near zero.
"Okay," said the navigator. 5,000 feet. Our geomapping sensors are operating at about half of its capacity because of the interference, but we should be out from under this overcasting. Pull up! Pull up! Pull up!
Instinctively, Warrant Officer Nasri pulled up sharply just as what appeared to be a colossal metallic ribcage loomed into view. The bottom of the gunship scraped the metallic structure and bounced sideways as Nasri pulled hard right on the stick. A second curved metallic rib loomed up as the gunship dived, Nasri narrowly missing a collision with what appeared to be a crumbling metallic wall. She spun the gunship into a hover, using the maneuvering thrusters to keep the gunship steady in midair. They all looked up. not believing what their eyes were seeing. The gunship was at a hover about 2,000 feet above the ground, and right beside them lay the wrecked form of an alien craft nearly 4,000 feet high and over 1.5 miles long. It was shaped like a metallic cigar, but with the metallic wrapping peeling away and the innards hanging out. The entire top part of what could be called its fuselage had collapsed, leaving only the giant curving support structures, which resembled a rib cage, standing. Staring into the gaping hole of the fuselage, Warrant Officer Nasri could see what appeared to be 100, if not more, decks to the wrecked ship. The entire craft was an ash and charcoal black color, as if it had rested here for thousands of years. The crew stared in breathless awe, both at the sight of such a gigantic craft as well as the knowledge that they had almost crashed into the thing. Nasri gulped, then said, "Can you get a fix on the Newcastle?" "Not with the nav aids or the guidance telemetry, but if I can pull up the geo-coordinates of the Newcastle and compare them to our short-range geomap." The navigator punched a few keys on his console, and the geo-coordinates and geomap display appeared on Nasri's heads-up display. "Hey, look at that," said the navigator. "We're only 10 miles due east of the Newcastle." Nasri, still breathing hard from their near collision, nodded and turned the gunship to where the geo-coordinates and the geomap had synchronized into a plot point on the two-dimensional computer-generated map on the HUD. "How you guys doing back there?" she yelled into the intercom. "We're banged up, but fine," came the voice of Lieutenant Gabriel. "I can see what a few of my Marines have for breakfast, though. I don't know what just happened, but let's try not to do that when we leave." "No promises," said Nasri. "We're about 10 miles from the Newcastle, so we'll be on the ground in a few minutes." The Newcastle had come to grief in a shallow depression surrounded by a low ridge. It looked to have belly flopped, landing slightly on one side, meaning that it did not come in at a steep angle and crash, but rather seemed to have been pulled straight down. The luxury liner was broken in half and had come to grief bent at an angle with the fuselage tilted to its starboard side by a few degrees. Both upper and lower maneuvering wings had collapsed from the impact, and the bottom 2 decks had also crumpled. Other than that, the luxury liner seemed to be in relatively good condition for a ship that was pulled 250 miles straight down out of orbit. Warrant Officer Nasri set the gunship down on a relatively flat part of the rocky terrain, about 50 meters from the Newcastle, and the Marines quickly disembarked out of the back ramp and circled the gunship, forming a perimeter. Every Marine was on alert, either prone or on one knee behind the cover of some rock outcropping, weapons trained in an arc to their front, which would allow interlocking field of fire should the need arise. Each squad had a set of handheld ranging sensors which not only magnified visuals, but also took motion scans, thermal scans, IR scans, as well as radiological readings. Lieutenant Gabriel went around to each squad, checking with their ranging sensors, and although the interference halved their effective range, each ranging sensor showed that there was no movement or no heat signatures out to about 200 meters. They were alone on this cold patch of land. Gabriel took the ranging sensor and put the eyepiece up to his eyes, scanning the wreckage of the Newcastle. Although it showed signs of residual heat emanating from its main thrusters and maneuvering thrusters, there was no sign of life. "Second squad," said Gabriel to Staff Sergeant Talley into the platoon net. "Stay here and secure the perimeter. Keep an eye out for movement and cover our ass. First, third, move out slowly towards the Newcastle." Both squads began maneuvering over the earth-blasted black landscape, covering the short 50-meter distance to the wrecked starship. It was eerily quiet, with no sounds of buzzing insects or carrion birds. It was as if all living things on the planet shunned this place. Lieutenant Gabriel and his comspec linked up with Hernandez's third squad and held up a fist to halt the platoon when they were a few meters from the wreck. What looked like bits and pieces of flesh and uniforms littered the ground in the area where the ship had broken in half. Lieutenant Gabriel motioned with his finger, and Staff Sergeant Boyer's first squad ran into the wreckage, followed closely by third squad, the noise of rocks crunching under their boots. Soon they were surrounded by the mass of the wreckage. Wires and cables still hung from fallen panels and bulkheads as the Marines looked around for bodies.
"It's weird, sir,"
said Hernandez. "There are body parts and pieces of bodies, but no bodies." "Let's head inside," said Gabriel. The ship had 5 decks. The upper 2 decks were in the superstructure and contained the command and navigation. That superstructure had collapsed. The middle deck held the executive VIP suites, and the bottom 2 decks were crew quarters and ship's operations. "First squad, take the front part of the ship. We'll take the aft. Let's see if we can locate any signs of the VIPs. Be careful because the ship is more than likely unstable." The ship was leaning at a slight angle, which made footing tricky as the Marines entered the twisted metal interior of the ship. The deeper they went into the hull, the darker and more foreboding. Soon the Marines had to switch on their helmet lights and flash beams on their rifles to see inside. All around them, their lights shone on wreckage and debris, but no bodies.
"Do you think that the bodies got crushed below decks?"
asked Private First Class Chensi to Sergeant Hernandez. "Possibly," he answered. "But even degraded, our ranging sensors should be able to pick them up through these thin bulkheads."
4 actual. This is 1 actual.
Lieutenant Gabriel's comms came alive with the sound of Staff Sergeant Boyer's voice from the front part of the ship.
"This is 4 actual. Go." "Hey, sir," said Boyer. "No bodies in the front part of the ship, but we've got evidence of some kind of struggle. We found one of the security guard's submachine guns with its bolt open and an empty mag. There are empty shell casings all around and 3 empty mags on the ground in a dry pool of blood."
"Roger, 1 actual," said Gabriel. "Keep searching and stay frosty. Keep me updated."
"Hey,"
said Lance Corporal Mixley, one of 3rd Squad's riflemen.
"Look at this."
Gabriel and Henderson looked to the floor and bulkhead where Mixley was shining his light. Relatively fresh bloodstains were splattered everywhere, along with more pieces of flesh. More disturbingly, a bloody kitchen knife and a few spent shell casings littered the bloody deck.
"I don't know what happened here," whispered Hernandez, "but whatever it was, they went hand to hand when they ran out of ammo."
Next to the carnage was a half-opened hatch, and a bloody handprint seemed to lead out of it.
Said Sergeant Watson to one of the team leaders. "Getting a very slight sensor reading from this ranging sensor. It's coming from behind that hatch."
Sergeant Watson slowly pushed open the hatch, which creaked loudly as it swung backwards and clanged against the bulkhead. Slowly peering inside with the light of his rifle, Watson could see that the hatch opened to a shallow stairwell which led down to the lower level. Shining his light downwards into the darkness, the light revealed that the forward portion of that level of the ship had been crushed in the crash. But the aft section was relatively undamaged. Down and to the left was a shut hatch door.
"Sir,"
said Sergeant Watson, "I've got a stronger heat signature reading. It's coming from inside that hatch." "Stay up here," said Lieutenant Gabriel, taking the ranging sensor from Sergeant Watson and looking down the stairs. "The bulkhead looks unstable." Still forced to walk at an angle due to the way the ship had landed on its side, Lieutenant Gabriel carefully descended the stairwell, looking down and around to shine his helmet light in all directions, just in case something were to jump out of the darkness. Once he hit the lower deck, Sergeant Hernandez followed down the stairs. Once on the lower level, Hernandez stood back to back with Gabriel, pointing his rifle down the corridor. His light showed a bloodied bulkhead and deck, but again, no bodies. He walked backwards as Gabriel followed forwards a few steps until he was standing in front of the hatch. It was sealed and locked, but the ranging sensor definitely indicated that something warm was moving about on the other side of the hatch. A blood-stained metal plaque next to the hatch read, "Pantry," painted in fancy gold lettering. Sergeant Hernandez jumped unconsciously as Gabriel banged on the hatch door, yelling, "United States Marines, we're here to get you out." His banging and yelling echoed across the crypt-like corridor, but there was no response from within. He banged on the hatch again, repeating, "U.S. Marines, We're here to get you out." This time there was an audible gasping and scurrying coming from behind the hatch.
"Chancy,"
yelled Gabriel up the stairs.
"Flame gun."
Several Marines in the upper deck yelled for PFC Chancy, followed by the clang, clang, clang of boots stomping down the metal stairs. Gabriel pointed at the hatch, and Chancy nodded. Private First Class Chancy set the firing aperture to her flame gun on its lowest setting, 1/2 millimeter, in effect turning it into a high-temperature plasma beam. This was the lowest setting before the firing aperture fully closed, and Chancy had to be careful that the aperture wasn't fully closed when she fired the weapon for obvious explosive reasons. Using the flame gun as a narrow plasma beam used up a lot of energy, and it wasn't recommended to be used in this manner for more than a minute because of the high heat being generated. But in only seconds, Chancy had cut an 8-inch square section out of the steel bulkhead, next to the armor-locked hatch. She then made short work of the 2 half-inch thick steel bars which locked the hatch to the pantry, slicing clean through them as if they were sticks of butter. Once the locks were cut, the hatch was thrown open and Sergeant Hernandez burst into the pantry, followed closely by Lieutenant Gabriel. They were met by the high, shrill shrieking of someone screaming. It took Sergeant Hernandez some time to calm Hunter hiding down and stop him from screaming so loudly, but the former Vice President's son was so incoherent and panicked with fear that it was only after the medic, Lance Corporal Chapman, injected him with a mild tranquilizer that Hunter hiding finally ceased to become a danger to himself and the Marines. He slumped down on his butt, smiling dumbly and mumbling. "Oh, my God!" screeched Seashell, hands over her mouth. She was crouching down next to Hunter, shaking his shoulders. "What did you do to him? Oh my God! Did you drug him? Oh my God! What took you so long to get here? Oh my God, you people are going to be in so much trouble for this. Oh my God!" She was wearing the same white pantsuit combination that the Marines saw her wearing a week ago, although now it was dingy and stained with grey and brown streaks. "Check her vitals out, would you, chaps?" Gabriel said as he squatted down next to Seashell. "Are you okay? Are you hurt? What happened to you? Where are the crew?" "Something grabbed the ship and started to pull us down," she stammered. "The ship's captain tried to reverse us out of there, but we didn't have enough power to pull away, and we were slowly pulled to the ground." Gabriel thought for a moment. The beam was only slightly strong enough to slowly bring the Newcastle to the ground. It didn't crash in flames, but was more of a controlled crash. Now, the Galveston city has considerably more thrust than a luxury liner, but the beam is using just enough energy to bring the Galveston crashing down without completely vaporizing it. The same probably happened with the Sydney Point and all of the other wreck ships. That indicated an intelligence behind the anomaly. "Her vitals are fine, sir," said Chaps, removing the Velcro bands which he'd wrapped around her forehead, upper arm and ankle, which gave readings of the body's vital signs and biometrics, transmitting the information to the medic's patient datapad. Satisfied that Seashell was as well as could be expected, despite minor bruising on her knees and her thighs, Chaps concluded his initial examination of the VIP. Maybe a little dehydrated, but locking themselves in the galley, they weren't hunting for food. "What happened to the crew, Miss Kalari?" said Gabriel. "Most of them died in the crash," she said, "including the captain and 2 of my security team. Hunter and I were strapped into our executive crash seats inside the double-reinforced VIP executive suite when the ship went down. We crawled out and we saw Sydney Point in the distance. So while the surviving crew members began trying to repair the communications equipment on the Newcastle, Hunter sent the remaining 2 security guards to the Sydney Point to make contact with the colonists. We wanted to let them know that we still stood in solidarity with them against President Helania's hatred and bigotry, and that we were not their enemy. We needed them to know that we're part of the great galactic awakening, and understood that they probably built that beam as a defensive measure against President Helania's hatred and bigotry. So you see, we can overcome this miscommunication and resolve our differences using a conscience of galactic coexistence and without shooting and violence." Part 4. "Wait," said Gabriel, rubbing his temples. So you're saying that you and your entourage traveled all the way out here to the rim walls because you thought that the reason why the Willow's Well colonists cut all communications with Earth was because they hated the current president and they were protesting against her? Is that what you're saying?
What else could it have been?
Seashell Killery looked up at Lieutenant Gabriel like he was stupid.
I mean, President Helania is a racist bigot who obviously hates the Rimworld colonies, so it's clear that's why Willow's Well colonists cut all communications with Earth. It's so obvious. They were protesting. That's why me and Hunter came here to show our solidarity with their revolution against President Helania's oppression. Only someone who's not awake and mentally alert to the systemic galactic unfairness that plagues humanity would have thought it was something else.
Have you seen the Sydney Point, ma'am? Said Gabriel. It's a dead ship. It crashed, just like yours did.
President Helania's fault, obviously, said Seashell. Somehow she caused it to crash because of her hatred and bigotry against the Rimworlds, and therefore prompting the peaceful colonists to build that beam weapon in self-defense.
Private First Class Chency, who was standing behind Killery, rolled her eyes, then pointed at the barrel of her flame rifle with her finger, then pointed her finger to the back of Killery's head.
No,
said Lieutenant Gabriel, shaking his head at her in annoyance. Chency shrugged, pouting. Seashell Killery turned around, looking at Chency with confusion. Chency smiled back innocently at the senator's daughter. Gabriel rolled his eyes. Okay, so what happened to the surviving crew? We didn't see any bodies, just pieces of bodies. What happened?
Seashell gulped, suddenly bursting with tears. We were attacked. They killed the crew.
Who? Said Gabriel. Who attacked and killed the crew?
Well, the colonists. They died and killed all the crew, screamed Seashell. The colonists died and killed the crew.
Gabriel immediately got on the platoon comms. Heads up, Marines. We may have hostiles in the area. Lock and load and be on the lookout for any movement, particularly any of the colonists. Staff Sergeant Tally, I need your squad outside to secure a perimeter around the Newcastle. Gunship, you see anything?
Negative, replied Warrant Officer Nasri. Our topographic scanners are clear out to a half mile. What's up? Did you make contact with the VIPs?
Roger, Gunship, said Gabriel. I'll fill you in later after we're sure our perimeter is clear.
He turned back to Seashell.
What do you mean, that they died and killed the crew?
They died and they killed the crew, repeated Seashell. They died and they killed the crew. Hunter and I ran in here and seated ourselves in the pantry. We haven't been outside since.
You locked the rest of the crew outside? Asked Gabriel.
Seashell stood up, holding her arms across her chest, screaming at the top of her lungs at Lieutenant Gabriel. No more questions. What's your big plan to get us back to Earth? I want to go home. You'll be in so much trouble with my daddy if you don't get me home. She fell back down next to the babbling Hunter hiding, crying.
She's in shock, sir, whispered Chaps into Gabriel's ear.
You want me to prep another trank?
Lieutenant Gabriel considered it, if only to shut her up. But he held up his hand and shook his head. Gabriel turned to his Marines. Private First Class Chency, you stay here, secure the site, and keep an eye on Miss Killery and Mr. Hiding here. Chency looked down at Hunter Hiding, sitting on the floor with his legs splayed out in front of him, head lolling to one side and drool coming out of his mouth. She rolled her eyes.
Sir, why me? Why can't Hauser or Milroy do it? When someone eventually writes our story, I don't want to be known as the Marine that just cut the lock and did absolutely nothing else.
Gabriel looked at Chency. She was the newest member of the platoon, straight out of Paris Island, just like Private Melly in Golf Company. She wanted to prove herself to her platoon, just like Melly, and this was her first deployment, just like Melly.
Because, do it, said Lieutenant Gabriel, a little harder than he'd intended. Then, softening his tone, he said, Besides, these VIPs are the primary objective of this mission. We need to get them home safe. Anything happens to them, it'll be your ass.
And our gunship is our ticket out of here, so you need to provide overwatch for them while they effect repairs.
Oh, sir, said Chancy,
making no attempt to hide her disappointment. Right, let's move out, said Gabriel into the platoon's internal comms net. We're headed to the anomaly point. Along the way, we're going to check out the wreckage of the Sydney point. Staff Sergeant Tally?
This is Tally,
came the second squad leader's voice from outside the ship. Good, thought Gabriel. At least we have internal platoon comms. Your squad's on point. Plot a path to the anomaly point, Gabriel ordered. Take us near the Sydney point. We'll give her a quick once-over, but priority is to disable that beam.
Roger, sir,
answered Tally. We're ready to move.
Good,
answered Gabriel. Staff Sergeant Boyer, your squad has slack. 10-meter spread.
Roger that,
answered Boyer. Then turning to face Sergeant Hernandez, he said, Your squad's tail end, Charlie.
Whoa, sir,
Hernandez replied. Then, turning to Chancy, Hernandez pointed to her, then to his own eyes, then pointed to the two VIPs. Comprende, he said. Anything happens to them and this mission is a bust.
Yes, Sergeant,
she said. Let's move, said Gabriel, grabbing up his M88 rifle, and in seconds the platoon was assembled in the designated march order formation outside of the wreckage of the CSNS Newcastle. Tally put Corporal Parker's team on point and joined them at the head of the column, leading the 41 Marines of the 4th Platoon Delta on a path which would bring them close to where the Sydney point rested, about 1.5 miles away. About 3 miles to the northwest of the Sydney point, slightly offset to the left on what appeared to be a pyramid-shaped granite mound, was the needle-like peak from which the red beam was shooting into space. Gabriel ran to the gunship, filling Nasri in on what they'd found in the wreckage of the Newcastle, and that they were preparing to march to the Sydney point and onwards to the beam. For her part, Nasri filled Gabriel in on the status of their gunship. Several systems on the gunship were damaged during the landing, which would affect their navigation and re-entry into orbit. She was hoping the systemic failures were because of the anomaly and not because of any internal damage. There was structural damage under the fuselage when they struck the wreckage of the alien ship, and the lifting arm which actuated the rollers of the hangar bay was inoperable, meaning that they wouldn't have the ability to roll the explosive out the back if they needed to. It would take hours for her, the gunner and the navigator to clear up the ship for upper atmosphere flight again, since this was a task usually handled by entire maintenance systems crew. "Don't you do anything to ruin my Vegas vacation," Nasri said, pointing an accusing finger at Gabriel as he left to join his platoon. He nodded back, getting the message. His Marines began their road march to the Sydney point, which was visible in the distance, resting on a plateau rising above a mass of jumbled rock slabs. They descended off of the rise they were on, then followed a wide ravine which ran roughly due north. Above them, the black clouds whipped and whirled, and cold winds blew, but no rain fell upon the parched, cracked earth. The dry black ground was strewn with rocks which threatened to twist feet and ankles. "Watch your steps, Marines," yelled the squad leaders. "Ain't no one here gonna carry you back if you hurt yourself." Lieutenant Gabriel, his Comspec Lance Corporal Magas, and the platoon medic Lance Corporal Chapman walked with Staff Sergeant Boyer's squad in the middle of the column. "Any comms with the Galveston Steady, Magas?"
"Still nothing, LT,"
replied Magas. "Okay," Gabriel said, not thinking that there would be. They had lost comms with the Galveston City when the platoon entered this topographical anomaly. Switch the comms channel with the Galveston to receive only. Let's save that battery power. Don't lose comms with our gunship. She's our only ticket out of here.
"We've got good line-of-sight comms with her out to about 3 clicks,
said Magas. "But beyond that, I can't promise anything, sir."
"Okay.
Keep me updated if anything changes," said Gabriel. Though the planet looked lush and thriving from orbit, the area which the Marines were walking in looked as if it had been dead for untold millions of years. Absolutely nothing lived in this bleak and barren wasteland, with its slabs of flat, black rock jutting up from the ground at unnatural angles, canyons of sheer black granite walls, and miles of black rocky plains filled with nothingness. The sky was dark and foreboding, appearing more like a stormy evening that threatened tornadoes, although it was technically mid-morning on this hemisphere of the planet, and everywhere else it was bright and sunny. As the Marines drew ever closer to the wreckage of the giant skeletal remains of the Sydney Point, they noticed that even the abundance of birds and insects avoided this blasted land, and an eerie silence enveloped everything save for the occasional howl of cold wind, the cascade of falling rock as it tumbled down a rock face, or the eerie creaking noise of metal in the distance coming from a long, dead starship. All around them were the rotting forms of alien space wreckage. From the ground it appeared that they'd crashed in some type of circular pattern radiating from the center of the topographical anomaly, something which Warrant Officer Nasri confirmed from their bumpy flight to the ground. Lieutenant Gabriel activated his VidCam to document their surroundings, focusing particularly on the alien wreckage in the distance, and ordered his squad leaders to designate one or two of their Marines to do the same. He wished that he had more time to examine them closely, but that wasn't part of the mission. "Hey, LT." "What's up, chaps?" Gabriel said to the medic.
"Sir, I was just trying to wrap my head around what Killary said. It just doesn't make sense."
"Tell me something she said that does make sense, chaps," laughed Gabriel.
"No, seriously, sir," replied Chapman. "Look, first she said they crashed. Got it. Then she said that some of the survivors went to the Sydney Point to try and find help. I'm tracking that too. Then she said that the colonists were dead. Yeah, I'm still tracking. Then she said that the colonists attacked them. Now I'm as lost as a second lieutenant with a compass and a GPS. Are they dead? Or did they attack them?"
Lieutenant Gabriel had been thinking the same thing, though said nothing at first. "Well, chaps, she did get banged around a lot during the crash. Maybe she got confused. Maybe some of the surviving colonists attacked them. Then they died."
The medic walked a few more steps, doubt etched all across his face. "Do you believe that, sir?"
"After all we've been through with this deployment," thought Gabriel, "hell no."
Instead, Lieutenant Gabriel said,
"Just stay alert and be flexible, chaps. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if we're dealing with fairy godmothers."
Staff Sergeant Talley's route of march to the wreckage of the Sydney Point was about as quick as could be expected, given the circumstances, coupled with the fact that they were on constant lookout for whomever it was that presumably attacked and killed the surviving crew members of the Newcastle. They only had to double back once, when a path descended between two sheer cliffs and ended in a rock-face wall. They had to fall back up the path and walk about 300 meters east before Staff Sergeant Talley was able to find another path which brought the platoon around the obstruction and back on course towards the colonizer ship. It wasn't difficult to miss the Star Cruiser, as the Sydney Point was 130 meters high, and she could be seen in the distance. As they got closer to the ship, the Marines could see that the long, thick ship had come to grief on a large plateau which rose about 50 feet above the rest of the surrounding landscape and was broken up into three major segments. The rear section, with its banks of 6 monstrously huge thrust engines, rested about 100 meters to the rear of the rest of the ship. It was about halfway up the plateau, and the section which had become separated from the rest of the ship was angled up towards the stormy skies. The middle section, where the majority of the colonists would have been housed, was almost on the middle of the plateau and was bent almost in the shape of an L. The bottom of this section had collapsed, crushing the bottom 2 levels, which would have held the equipment, construction materials, vehicles, and livestock. The upper 3 levels would have housed the colonists and the crew. The front 50 meters of the ship, where the bridge was located, had broken off and was turned on its side. The broken part turned and facing in such a way that the Marines could look inside the ship. Even at this distance, they could see the 5 levels of the interior of the ship, even though the front part of the doomed colonizer was completely flattened by the impact. The Marines were in a slight depression that ran parallel to the front of the plateau. A rocky ledge to their left wrapped around like a natural ramp up to the top. Cautiously, they ascended the ledge, weapons pointed outwards just in case of an ambush. Talley was on point and just below the lip of the plateau. She went to one knee, halting the platoon.
Immediately the rest of the platoon went to a knee, taking up firing positions just in case.
"Hey, LT," she said into the platoon comm system to Gabriel. "You're gonna want to see this."
Gabriel, his comm-spec, and the medic shuffled to the head of the column, taking a knee next to Staff Sergeant Tally. She pointed with a gloved knife hand ahead of her towards the wreckage roughly 100 meters to their front.
"Take a look, sir," she said.
Before the stunned Marines lay thousands and thousands of bodies, presumably the passengers and crew of the Sydney Point. Their bodies and pieces of bodies broken and decaying, with most still wearing scraps of clothes which were charred and burned. But despite the disturbing scene that met them, two things made the scene ultimately more troubling and eerie. First, although the Sydney Point came to grief over 8 months ago, the condition of the corpses seemed to indicate that they'd been here for far longer, as there was no tissue on any of them at all, and the bones were blackened and seemed petrified with age. This might have been explained away by hypothesizing that the blackened and aged condition of the colonists' remains was due to the high heat and fire resulting from the crash. However, all of the bodies had been lined up in almost a perfect formation in ranks and rows similar to a military formation, except that they all seemed to have fallen backwards at the same time. There were no bodies visible inside the ship itself. It was as if the blackened corpses were all methodically lined up outside.
"What the hell, sir?"
whispered Tally. "Did the two security guys do this all by themselves?" "I doubt it," said the medic, pointing to 2 black mounds lying around the corner of a raised pile of rocks about 20 meters away. Gabriel, Tally, and the rest of the Point squad carefully walked the rest of the way up the plateau towards the mound, weapons up and ready just in case. Almost perfectly camouflaged against the black rocks, the 2 mounds ended up being the ripped and torn bodies of the security team members dressed in their black, military-style uniforms. Unlike the colonists, their bodies looked like they died fairly recently. There wasn't much left of them, and their innards had been ripped open, and although both of their jaws had been ripped away, the terrified looks in their dead eyes showed that they died fully aware of what was happening to them. Gabriel called up the rest of the platoon and had them form a loose perimeter around the plateau facing outwards. In the middle of the perimeter, standing next to the remains of the 2 security guards and well away from the weird formation of dead bodies, Lieutenant Gabriel called a huddle with his squad leaders. Gabriel looked down at the 2 small-caliber submachine pistols which belonged to the security guards, along with the empty magazines lying next to them. Whatever had killed the security guards, they went down firing as hundreds of metal casings surrounded the spot where they died.
"Theories?"
asked Gabriel.
"None that make any sense," said Sergeant Hernandez. "I mean, it's hard to tell what they were shooting at. Did they shoot at these dead bodies? The bodies are already so messed up we can't tell."
Gabriel looked down at his watch, which he'd programmed as a countdown timer to when the Galveston would be forced to eject its boats to save its crew. 5 hours and 38 minutes. Not much time left. "Take 15 here," said Gabriel. "Stay alert. We don't know what killed these security guys. Squad leaders, make sure your Marines hydrate. We have a 3-mile hum to that beam." As they took a little breather, all of the Marines spoke to each other in hushed tones. Already this mission had reached a level of creepy that few of them had experienced before. From the edge of the perimeter, Sergeant Hernandez suddenly gave out a sharp laugh.
"Split up,"
said Sergeant Hernandez.
"Hey, Boyer, your guy Hauser says that we need to split up."
"What?" yelled Staff Sergeant Tally.
"Split up? Marine, are you crazy?"
"Sure," the young Marine said nervously. "Maybe we should split up. One squad stays here at the wreck to investigate what caused this to happen. One team goes to blow up the beam. By splitting up, we could—" Hauser stopped as he saw his fellow Marines smiling and shaking their heads. The rest of the Marines chuckled as Staff Sergeant Boyer, Private Hauser's squad leader, put a hand on the young Marine's shoulder armor. Hauser was the youngest and lowest-ranking Marine in First Squad, and was so wet behind the ears he was drowning.
"Hauser, man,"
said Boyer, his big white teeth showing from under a moustache sarcastic smile. In a situation like this, with limited comms and near zero credible intel, Marines don't split up unless it's an emergency, because Marines don't like to lose fire superiority. And we like to think we're a wee bit smarter than those camp counselors on your classic Friday the 13th romance movies. Lieutenant Gabriel allowed himself a small laugh, then ordered, "Activate your vid cams and get a few minutes of footage. Maybe forensics can identify some of these folks and determine how all these bodies ended up outside their ship. We only have 6 hours left to blow that thing, and a 3-mile hump ahead of us." He looked to the distance, at the weird horn-shaped structure sticking out of the high mound. The reddish-white glow of the beam still shot straight up, disappearing into the dark, stormy skies above. The wind had picked up, blowing cold, musty air which smelled like the inside of a crypt. There was no sound, no buzz of insects, no rustle of bent and broken metal swaying in the breeze. There was just the crumble of rock and grit under booted feet, as Marines walked around the plateau filming the landscape of corpses and the gutted remains of the Sydney Point. A minute later, Gabriel said, "All right, saddle up, let's move out. Staff Sergeant Boyer, your squad is on point." The forced march to the beam followed the same monotonous dead landscape, occasionally broken by slabs of rock that jutted into the sky or ravines which needed to be crossed. Every once in a while the Marines would walk past the wreckage of some alien vessel, long dead and black with age, that made it look as if it were part of the unnatural landscape. But Gabriel pushed his Marines onwards, not taking any precious time to investigate. As before, there were no signs of any bodies, human or otherwise. The Marines took one more 10-minute break when they were halfway to the structure, just below the lip of a low ridge, and then continued on. Lieutenant Gabriel led the platoon for the last half of the forced march, and halted his Marines in a shallow depression about 100 meters from where the blinding reddish-white beam was emanating from the spike-shaped structure. The temperature was much warmer here, no doubt because of the heat being generated by the beam. Gabriel pulled out his ranging sensors and directed them at the weird structure. The black spike was curved like a horn, and by the way the rock seemed to have been pushed up around it, looked to have emerged from below the ground to extend 20 feet into the air. Not surprisingly, the power levels emanating from the beam were beyond the ability for the ranging sensor to read. The spike itself was roughly 6 feet in diameter, and judging by the thermal readings which the sensor was displaying, the energy source was coming from somewhere under the ground and being directed into a pinpoint beam of only 1 foot at the tip of the spike and directed into space, much like how Private First Class Chensi had minimized the firing aperture of her flame gun to create a makeshift plasma cutter. The peculiar thing was, the ranging sensor was indicating that incredible amounts of heat were being generated by the spoke, but the spike itself remained the same ambient temperature than the air around it. A humming sound accompanied by the soft rumbling of what could be described as an engine buried underground emanated from the thing. "Okay," said Gabriel. "Everybody give first squad all of your debts. Explosive blocks, grenades, line charges. Give first squad everything that can detonate except your ammo." "What's up, sir?" asked Staff Sergeant Boyer as he crouched down next to his platoon leader. "Ever decorate a Christmas tree, Boyer?" asked Gabriel. "Sir," said Boyer, "I'm Jewish." "Yeah," said Gabriel, "but you're also my resident EOD expert. Come on." Directing his second and third squads to stay put and cover their backs just in case, Gabriel led his first squad, now loaded down with all the 4th platoon's debts, the rest of the way to the spike. He halted them a few feet from the structure. The reddish-white beam shone brightly on top of the spike, making it impossible to look at, and the heat from the beam had caused the temperature to rise to over 160 degrees. "Quickly now," said Gabriel, yelling over the wind which was howling at the base of the spike. "Attach the explosive blocks around the base of the spike and drape the line charges around the explosive blocks. Then hang your grenades on the line charges. Make sure that you secure them so they don't blow down." "Wow, sir," said Private Hauser, yelling over the wind. "It's just like decorating a Christmas tree." "Yeah," yelled Gabriel. "Now hurry and get it done before we roast." As the charges were being planted, Boyer was inserting the detonating caps into the explosive blocks. Lieutenant Gabriel came up behind him, yelling, "How do we look, Sergeant?"
"Good," replied Boyer. "This is almost overkill. Do you want to set it to time or command?"
"Set it to command," said Gabriel. "We don't know what kind of energy will be released when this blows, so I want us back at the Sydney Point when I detonate it."
"Roger that, sir,"
yelled Boyer over the howling wind. Suddenly the earth seemed to shift slightly, and some of the rock which surrounded the spike tumbled down from the slight tremor. Gabriel looked at the spike. It didn't seem mechanical or constructed in any way, although it was now obvious that its glossy black obsidian color was different from the surrounding rock. His Marines were just about finished setting the explosives, and Boyer ordered them to fall back to the rest of the platoon while he finished setting the detonators. By the time they were done, the Marines had decorated the spike with over 200 pounds of explosives, much like one would ornament a Christmas tree. Chaps, who was standing next to the spike, yelled, "Sir, you should see this." Gabriel ran up to his medic, who had his patient's vitals monitor pressed against the spike. Curious as to why his medic was doing this, he asked, "What you got, chaps?" The medic turned and said, "Sir, either this monitor is completely off the deep end, or else it's showing that this spike is carbon-based."
"What?"
Gabriel looked at the monitor in disbelief. Sure enough, the monitor was showing that the spike was 50% carbon-based, almost exactly the same amount of carbon as in human bones. The implications were staggering. "Are you saying this thing is alive, chaps?"
"I don't know what to say, sir,"
he replied.
"We're set, sir,"
yelled Staff Sergeant Boyer, plugging in the last of his detonator caps.
"Can we get out of this oven now?"
"Yeah, let's move," said Gabriel, grabbing his medic and directing him back to the depression where the rest of the platoon waited. The temperature had dropped at least 50 degrees when the last of First Squad finally entered the shallow depression, and although they only spent less than 3 minutes setting up the explosive, the First Squad was completely exhausted and drenched in sweat, as they'd baked in their armor, which was now hot to the touch. Gabriel spared them a few minutes to hydrate, then checked his timer. They only had 3 hours and 22 minutes to march back to the Sydney Point and take cover behind the plateau. At that distance, Gabriel hoped that they'd be safe from any residual fallout caused by the blast. "Saddle up," he said. "We need to get clear of the area." Lieutenant Gabriel personally took point, marching his Marines all the way back across the broken and blasted landscape which they just traversed. The further away they got from the beam, the lower the temperature became until it had dropped back down into the 60s again. Gabriel didn't stop this time, as they had a limited time to get back to the Sydney Point and detonate the explosives. The Marines had already marched over 8 miles on rough and hostile terrain since they'd landed, and they still had miles to go. Eventually, however, the wreckage of the Sydney Point appeared in the distance, and the Marines, spurred on by the sight, quick-timed the last 3/4 miles to the plateau on which it rested. However, once they got there, all of the Marines froze. "Okay," said Corporal Parker, who was leading the point team. "Where do they go? Where do the bodies go?" They were standing on a ridge where a saddle led down to the plateau. Gabriel scanned the ground where the bodies of the thousands of passengers and crew of the Sydney Point were laid out on the ground just a few hours earlier. There was no disturbance of the ground, no signs of bodies being moved or dragged. The corpses had all vanished, as if they'd never been there in the first place. "Hey, sir, look." Gabriel looked to where Staff Sergeant Talley was pointing. "Even the bodies of the security guards are gone." Gabriel nodded, looking at his timer. They had less than 30 minutes before the Galveston City would start launching their boats. "Follow me," he said. "We need to get down to below the plateau's lip. Keep your guns up, Marines, and stay alert." Again, Lieutenant Gabriel led his platoon down the saddle and through the wreckage of Sydney Point and across the ground which was once lined with thousands of dead bodies. His Marines looked nervously around, but said nothing, following their platoon leader as he approached the ledge which led down off the plateau. Quickly now," he said. "Get down below the plateau. Squad leaders, are you up?" Receiving confirmation that all his Marines were safely tucked away on the ledge, Gabriel called up Staff Sergeant Boyer. Boyer trotted to Gabriel, handing him the detonator controls, but Gabriel held up his hands. "You got this, Sergeant. I know how you EO guys like to make things go boom." Boyer smiled and, ducking low, clicked the actuating trigger on the handheld detonator. He and Gabriel ducked down as they looked back over the horizon to where the beam was still projecting into the sky. Boyer chuckled. "Must be the interference delaying the command detonating signal," he said, clicking the trigger again. They both ducked down again, but the beam was still shooting into the air, steadily dragging the Galveston city towards the planet. Boyer cursed, clicking the actuating trigger repeatedly. Gabriel looked down at his timer. Less than 20 minutes were left. Not nearly enough time to... Part 5. The explosion in the distance lit up the horizon in a blinding flash of white. Boyer and Gabriel were thrown off their feet as their bodies rolled off the plateau and down the ledge. Slabs of rock and debris, along with wreckage from the Sydney Point, sailed over their heads, and the Marines grabbed them by their body armor and pressed against the side of the plateau, which shielded them from the shockwave of the explosion. Clearly, the 200 pounds of ordnance couldn't have caused such a massive explosion, and once the shockwave had passed and all of the rock, debris, and wreckage had fallen, Lieutenant Gabriel and Staff Sergeant Boyer raced back up the plateau, followed closely by the rest of the platoon. Gabriel exhaled and sighed. The red beam was no longer firing into the sky. Boyer hit Lieutenant Gabriel on his left shoulder armor. "See," he said, "it was just interference. You should never doubt me." Gabriel laughed. "I didn't for 1 second. As the platoon of Marines allowed themselves a cheer of success as the black smoke rose in the distance where the spike had once stood. All of a sudden, in the air around them and in the ground beneath them, and seemingly coming from inside of them, a low, moaning roar filled the environment. The ground shook as if an earthquake had struck, and many Marines lost their footing. In the distance where the spike once stood, the ground shook, then spurted upwards like a volcano being born. 2 spikes now erupted from the ground, one broken at the tip, each curving and pointing in towards each other, and rose higher into the sky. Beside the spikes, 2 black columns also broke through the earth, each hundreds of feet long, and stretched up towards the sky. At the end of the 2 black spikes, skeletal fists opened into skeletal hands which grasped into the air. The hands slammed back down to earth, and 2 black skeletal arms pushed, forcing a hellish thing to emerge from the ground. The 2 spikes were indeed massive black horns, which connected to a monstrous skull, which was oddly human in appearance. Flames of bright red emanated from empty eye sockets and its open, massive maw. It pushed itself out of the earth, craning its bony neck skywards as it strained to free itself from the rocks which had imprisoned it until, finally, it pulled one hoofed skeletal leg out of the ground, and then another. The horrific monstrosity stood up clumsily, rising hundreds of feet in the air, and looked towards where the frightened Marine stood with flaming red eyes filled with hunger and malice. It felt the tip of its right horn, with a massive 6-fingered black skeletal hand. 20 feet of the horn was missing, blown apart when the Marines set the explosives, leaving a length of only 30 feet remaining, attached to the demonic-looking skull. The demonic entity leaned forwards, opening its mouth, and screamed at the Marines who were standing at the plateau 3 miles away. It clenched its fists, raising them into the air, and the ground around the Marines rumbled. Then, still standing unsteadily, the giant skeletal horror began walking towards the Marines. The earth rumbled with every labored step it took. Staff Sergeant Tally, looking at her ranging sensor, yelled, "We got movement!" "I can see that," said Gabriel. "No, we got other movement," Tally yelled. "Where?" yelled Lieutenant Gabriel.
Staff Sergeant Tally pointed at the ground. All around us, sir. The Marines were gathered almost at the center of the plateau and had witnessed the birth of the gigantic, demonic-looking skeleton, when suddenly, all around their feet, skeletal hands began pushing up from the ground. Slowly, inexorably, thousands of undead corpses began pulling themselves up from the black earth. The Marines were surrounded by the things and outnumbered hundreds to one. From what remained of decaying throats and windpipes, the undead things, which once used to be human occupants of the CSNS Sydney Point, began bellowing and moaning as they reached out with clawed, decaying hands to the Marines who were stomping and kicking at the ground. With the Marines bunched together and the undead army literally rising up under them, the Marines had lost fire superiority. They couldn't risk shooting without hitting one another. "Move, Marines," yelled Gabriel, but stroking a skeletal corpse in front of him, which had just about completed pulling itself out of the ground. The creature fell backwards, but rose again, followed by more of its kind. Back down the ledge." The Marines began punching, kicking, and hitting the creatures with their weapons as they pushed towards the ledge which led down off the plateau. They fired only occasionally, only when they were sure that they would not hit another Marine. But for every creature that they shot center mass, dozens more took their place, and the creature that was hit would only rise again. "Open up," yelled Sergeant Hernandez. "Open up, but watch your muzzle. Don't flag your buddies." "Aim for the heads," yelled Private Hauser. He pointed his squad automatic at the two security guards, now part of the undead, which had risen from the ground. He squeezed off one more burst which ripped into the two security guards' heads, and the corpses collapsed, unmoving. "Hey, aim for their heads!" The Marines fell back, following the ledge down off the plateau, as they shot almost point blank into the heads of the corpses which blocked their way forwards. With controlled discipline, they bounded backwards by squads in order to keep up fire at the shambling skeletal remains which were slowly walking, limping, or dragging themselves forwards. The undead horde was extremely slow, however, and once the Marines were 200 meters ahead of their pursuers, Lieutenant Gabriel ordered the platoon to cease fire and halt their bounding maneuver, but continue to double time to the gunship. Lieutenant Gabriel stopped, allowing his platoon to file past him as they ran. "By the numbers," yelled Gabriel, breathing heavily into the platoon net. "Squad leaders, status report." "1 up," said Staff Sergeant Boyer. "2 up," replied Tally. "3 up," yelled Hernandez. Good, thought Gabriel. All of his Marines were accounted for. He looked back up the plateau which they'd come from, back past the thousands of dead and rotting corpses, and towards the unbelievably large and grotesque skeletal horror which had hauled itself out of the black earth. From where he stood, Gabriel estimated that the thing stood over 500 feet tall, with the span of its horns measuring 100 feet from point to point. This god of the undead, for indeed that's what it was if it was responsible for reanimating the corpses of the crash victims, was moving slowly, as if it was not used to using the skeletal legs on which it stood. However, though it was still miles away, every slow and awkward step that the monster took brought it ever closer to the retreating Marines. Gabriel turned and ran to catch up to his platoon. Staff Sergeant Boyer's first squad was in trail, and the squad automatic gunner, Private Hauser, along with the assistant gunner, Private Barner, would tail end Charlie. Lieutenant Gabriel caught up with them, sweating and breathing hard from all of the maneuvering that they were doing in full battle rattle. "Hey, Hauser, how are you doing?" Hauser's automatic rifle was heavier than the standard issue M88, and he carried the added weight of 200 or so 8.2mm caliber belted rounds. "I'm okay, sir." Hauser was just barely past his teens, and didn't even seem like he was breathing hard despite running with a heavy load. Somewhat jealous of the young Marine's youthful energy, seeing as Gabriel's 35th birthday was only a month away, Gabriel figured that's why the Corps made the young guys carry the heavy weapons. "How about you, Barner?" said Gabriel, turning to the assistant gunner who was carrying the spare barrel and an additional 300 rounds for the automatic rifle. "How are you holding up?
Your first deployment everything you thought it would be? Hoo-ha, she said as she ran along, easily keeping pace with everyone else. It's not too bad, but other packs would have been nice for this one. Yeah, they would have, agreed Gabriel. But the detachment only had enough to equip one platoon per company, and second platoon got priority. Maybe next time. Hoo-ah, sir, replied Barner, with not a hint of complaining in her voice. So, Hauser, said Gabriel, how'd you know that shooting him in the head would stop them? Oh, from a movie I watched, sir, replied Hauser. It was a documentary of life in the late 20th century by a guy called George Romero. Ah, I see, replied Gabriel. By now, Lieutenant Gabriel ordered his tired and sweating Marines to slow down. The Marines shuffled along at a moderate jog which kept some distance from the undead, which still relentlessly pursued him, while still giving the Marines the opportunity to watch their steps as they made their way across the rock-strewn landscape. The last thing they needed was someone twisting an ankle or knee. The giant, lumbering skeletal nightmare still followed behind and had closed the gap, but it was still 1.5 miles behind them. The Marines were in a saddle along the crest of a low ridge which would eventually bring them up a draw that rounded a bend which led back to the gunship and the wreck of the Newcastle. In the distance, the Marines could hear the faint, telltale moaning of the undead and the rapid-fire whooshing noise of a flame rifle. Above it all was the faint, unmistakable sound of a female voice cursing and yelling vulgar threats at the top of her lungs. The Marines raced around the bend in the saddle, eager to get to the crest and see what was going on at the crash site. Gabriel sprinted to his comspec. Magas, give me the gunship. Can't, sir, responded Magas. We're in a saddle and don't have line of sight. Shit, thought Gabriel. They were about 1/2 mile away, but still didn't have comms with the gunship. All of a sudden, there was a howl of air as the rush of thruster engines screamed as their gunship appeared over the ridgeline. Gabriel grabbed the handset. Jen, what's going on? Sam, get your asses down here, yelled Jennifer as the gunship dived below the crest of the ridge. I don't have any freaking ordnance, and they're closing in on Chency. Gabriel rounded the bend, climbing up the rise, and looked down towards the shallow depression. 1/2 mile away, he could see Chency standing atop the wreckage of the Newcastle, firing her flame rifle in wide arcs. Seashell Killery was standing behind her, screaming while attempting to climb higher up on a bent communication antenna, while Hunter Hiding knelt at Chency's feet, arms wrapped around the little Marine's left leg. Hunter Hiding's eyes and mouth were wide, and he was white as a sheet, peering down between Chency's legs at the mass of horrors which were trying to climb up the wreckage towards them. Gabriel stopped for a second to survey the scene before him. Between his Marines and where Chency was fighting on top of the wreckage was about a 1/4 mile thick horde of dead things clawing and scraping their way up the wreckage of the Newcastle. However, unlike the corpses of the Sydney Point, these undead horrors were definitely not human when they were alive. Very quickly, the Marines realized that these most likely were the reanimated remains of the vast array of alien vessels which had met their end here so long ago, and the cacophony of noises which escaped from the undead aliens was as deafening as it was horrific. Circling above Chency, Warrant Officer Nasri was flying the gunship in tight circles, trying to knock over the undead things with a thruster's jet wash, while trying not to blow Chency and the 2 idiot VIPs off the top of the wreckage. Chency, yelled Gabriel into the platoon comnet, able to reach his young Marine now that he had line of sight. Dead thing, sir, yelled Chency as she swept her flame rifle in a wide arc down towards a mass of skeletal claws and other weird bony appendages reaching up to her. Oh boy, there's a whole shit ton of galactic dead things down here. Hang on, Chency, yelled Sergeant Hernandez, looking desperately at Lieutenant Gabriel. We're coming to get you. Hang on. I'm not going anywhere, Sarge, replied Chency, but this idiot VIP hanging onto my leg keeps tripping me up. Can I roast him? No, yelled Hernandez. At least not until we get there. The eyes of the entire platoon were on Gabriel. He looked back at the horror closing in behind them. The horned monstrosity was just over 1 mile away.
Lock and load, ordered Gabriel. We're going right the fuck down the middle of that mess. Platoon wedge formation. First squad, take left. Second, take right. Sergeant Hernandez, your squad's on point. Let's get your flame gunner.
Hoo-ah!
Yelled Hernandez, and his entire third squad. Remember, like George Romero said, aim for the head, or at least what freaking looks like the head, yelled Gabriel as he raised his rifle. Okay, let's move, Marines. With a loud and thundering hoo-ah, the 41 Marines of the 4th Platoon, Delta Company, stormed down off the ridge, their formation looking like an arrow pointed right into the center of the horde of dead things. With cool and disciplined violence and aggression, the Marines fired bursts from their rifles into the skeletal horrors, which loomed ahead of them. The horde was so busy focusing on Chessie that by the time the undead displayed some type of cognitive reasoning that a danger loomed behind them, the Marines had already smashed into their midst, firing as they advanced. Lieutenant Gabriel was in the fore of his platoon, firing his weapon on burst, reloading, kicking, and using his rifle butt to knock away any undead alien which managed to claw its way towards him, then firing again. Although he didn't realize he was yelling, he could hear his Marines behind him yelling and cursing as they fought and fired. They were now completely surrounded by the undead, and the platoon collapsed in on itself, forming a circular perimeter as they continued to advance slowly towards the Newcastle. However, the dead were packed tight near the base of the Newcastle's wreckage, and as the platoon neared to only 100 feet, their forward progress slowed. A wall of dead aliens pressed in on all sides as the volume of fire from the Marines began to slacken. "We're getting low on ammo," yelled Hernandez. Just as Gabriel was thinking how he'd choke murder every bleeding heart politician who decided it would be a good idea to disarm his gunship, Jennifer brought down the gunship, swooping down at a steep angle between the Marines and the Newcastle before raising the throttle again and zooming back into the sky. The maneuver incinerated several of the undead, which had been blocking the Marines' path, and bowled over the rest, creating a temporary passage to the Newcastle 50 feet long and wide. Chaps, the medic, grabbed Lieutenant Gabriel and hefted him onto his feet. At least a dozen Marines were knocked off their feet by the blast of the thrust engines, and Gabriel's eyebrows were smoking from the heatwave. Quickly, though, all the Marines had recovered and were racing towards the wreckage of the Newcastle. Private Hauser cleared the remaining dead things from the front of the wreckage, spraying them with his automatic rifle. The rest of the platoon turned about, forming a tight perimeter below where Chensey had fought, and firing into the mass of the undead as the horde closed in around them. "Come on, Chensey," yelled Sergeant Hernandez, reaching up a hand. "This ain't no sightseeing tour." "Heads up," yelled Chensey as she raised the leg that Hunter Hiding was clinging so tightly to. "No, no, no, no," screeched Hunter as Chensey kicked him off her leg and the former Vice President's son fell 10 feet over the edge of the ship, only to be caught by Sergeant Hernandez. Chensey turned and reached up, grabbing Seashell Kilari, who climbed an astounding 2 feet up the ship's bent comms antenna. Seashell yelped as Chensey yanked her down, then carried her to the edge. She screamed, "What are you doing?" as Chensey dropped her into the waiting arms of Corporal Palkovich. Seeing that the 2 VIPs were in tow, Gabriel yelled into the radio, "Gunship, we could use a lift." The Marines were rapidly going blank on ammunition, some reporting that they were down to their last 1 or 2 magazines. Meanwhile, the skeletal death god was only half a mile away and getting closer with every labored step it made. "Can you clear me a space to land?" yelled Jennifer. "Second I touch down, those things will be all over the ship." Gabriel thought for a second. They'd have to fight to get clear of the wreckage and then fight to form a perimeter into which the gunship could land. Then they'd have to fight to collapse into the ship. They could do it, but would they have enough ammo? More than likely they wouldn't. It wasn't the best option, but it was the only one. He hated the thought that he might lose some of his people to get these VIPs safely back home to their rich and powerful mummies and daddies. But what choice did he have? Before he could give the order to advance back into the jaws of the undead, he heard Chensey yelling from atop the wreckage, "I got this!" Taking her flame rifle, she completely closed the firing aperture, then squeezed the trigger until the warning indicator sounded for her to shut down the weapon.
5 seconds, she yelled. Get the freak down!
Grabbing her beloved flame rifle like an Olympic shot put, Chancy spun around twice and tossed the rapidly overcharging weapon towards the area where the gunship had landed when they first arrived. The weapon sailed, spinning over the heads of the Marines, coming down about 25 meters away in the middle of a mass of skeletal terrors, before detonating in an explosive blast that resembled a miniature Hiroshima, complete with black mushroom cloud. Capitalizing on their 15-meter-wide clearing that the explosion had created, Jennifer dropped the gunship right in the middle, the rear end of the ship facing the Marines, ramp open.
Go, go, go,
yelled Gabriel, pushing Sergeant Hernandez and Corporal Palkovich forward.
Covering fire, Marines.
Still carrying the 2 VIPs, Hernandez and Palkovich raced forward towards the gunship, disappearing up the back ramp as the Marines behind them cleared away using the last of their ammunition.
Chancy,
yelled Gabriel, turning, his arms held wide.
Jump.
Don't drop me, yelled Chancy as he stepped off the wreckage and landed in Gabriel's arms.
My hero,
she said as Gabriel set her down on her feet.
Shut up and move, Chancy,
he yelled, and being the last of the Marines, they both ran to the ramp as quickly as they could, the undead rapidly closing in around them. The gunship lifted into the air as the Marines already inside the gunship yelled encouragement for them to hurry up. A few feet from the rear of the ship, Gabriel picked up Chancy and threw her up into the ramp, then jumped himself, just barely able to grab the steel grating of the metal ramp as the gunship gained altitude. Hernandez and Boyer climbed over the pallets of torpedoes and reached down, straining to yank their platoon leader into the cargo bay. With one heave, they jerked Gabriel into the gunship just inches above the reaching hands and claws of the undead. Gabriel rolled over and looked out the back ramp in time to see a massive skeletal hoof slam down on the ground behind them. The giant horned death god loomed over the gunship as Jennifer pulled the craft into a steep climb. Gabriel ran up the cargo bay, checking on his Marines and the VIPs as the gunship picked up speed.
Maglocks! Maglocks! Maglocks!
Jennifer screamed over the intercom.
Engage the maglocks on your boots. Hang on, I'm going vertical.
What? Yelled Gabriel.
The Helios wasn't designed to go vertical in atmosphere.
But the gunship pitched up as Jennifer grunted, straining for all she was worth to pull back on the stick and make the Helios gunship do something it was never designed to do. Staff Sergeant Tally grabbed Seashell Killery and hugged her close to keep her from flying out the back of the gunship, while Staff Sergeant Boyer grabbed Hunter Hiding. The air rushed through the open cargo bay like a tornado. Everything loose in the cargo bay fell out of the open ramp. Equipment, rucksacks, weapons, cases of mission-ready meals. Marines. Chancy's maglocks had been damaged while she was fighting off the dead things on the planet, and she fell towards the opening, desperately grabbing at anything. Lieutenant Gabriel watched in horror as Chancy fell past him. Chancy managed to grab a hold of a hydraulic cable near the aft roof of the cabin, but her fingers were slipping as the gunship climbed to near vertical. The metal pallets holding the makeshift bombs were slowly rising and sliding out of the back as Jennifer finally managed to point the nose of the gunship straight up into the sky. The pallets lifted about 4 inches off the deck and fell backwards out of the open ramp. The cables which held the pins of the secondary time fuses on the torpedoes broke away as the explosive fell from the gunship towards the skeletal horror below. The gigantic undead entity reached up with one of its skeletal arms, grabbing at the gunship. Each of the 6 30-foot-long fingers of its hand closed inexorably around the gunship as it hung almost stock still in midair. Suddenly, it noticed something falling out of the back of the gunship. Gabriel disengaged his maglocks and fell through the cargo bay right behind the pallets of bombs. He reached Private First Class Chancy and grabbed her just as she lost her grip. Now upside down, Lieutenant Gabriel slammed his feet as hard as he could on the upper bulkhead of the gunship, mere inches from being sucked out of the open ramp, and engaged the maglocks on his boots, holding on to Chancy with all his remaining strength.
Bombs away! Bombs away! Close the ramp! Close the damn ramp! Yelled Sergeant Hernandez into the intercom to the cockpit.
Jennifer pushed the stick forward, trying to level out the gunship, but instead the gunship leaned to the right and dived back towards the ground. Narrowly missing one of the horror's bony fingers, the gunship plunged to earth. Jennifer grunted again, the muscles in her arms, shoulders and neck screaming in pain as she pulled back on the stick with both hands, trying to bring the crashing gunship under control, as the terrestrial altimeter rapidly counted down the distance at which the gunship would nose into the ground. The skeletal monstrosity glared with flaming red eye sockets as the bombs dropped out of the escaping gunship and fell down towards it. The horned skull opened a black maw filled with row upon row of sharp, black, ragged teeth and roared in anger. Its distended jaws stretched 50 feet wide, and the 2 pallets with the 4 torpedoes flew straight down its throat. Part 6. The rear ramp on the gunship shut with a clang just as the torpedoes detonated. The gunship was still in a nosedive to the ground when the concussive force of the blast created a shockwave, which knocked the gunship off its terminal dive angle. Warning lights and alarms screamed inside the cockpit, but the rugged little gunship held together, despite the battering she'd just taken. With one last heave, Jennifer pulled up on the stick with every ounce of strength that she had left. The gunship shot up, narrowly missing the black, jagged landscape which seemed to rise up to meet them. Jennifer pulled the stick on the left, attempting to get past the periphery of the blasted black landscape and over to where the land was alive and green and beautiful. "We're clear of the anomaly," Warrant Officer Nasri's voice boomed into the intercom over the rising pitch of the thrusters. "Everyone okay back there?" "We're a little banged up," said Staff Sergeant Talley into the intercom speaker, looking down and frowning at the wet spot on her armor where Seashell Killery had pissed herself. "But we're fine. The medic's handing out boo-hoo band-aids and lollipops." "Okay," chuckled Nasri. "Where's Lieutenant Gabriel?" "Oh, he's hanging around, ma'am," said Sergeant Hernandez. "I see," said Nasri. "Well, when he's done farting around, let him know we have comms with the Galveston City. They've got freedom of maneuver and are in orbit, waiting to retrieve us. We should be docked in 15 to 20 mics." Lieutenant Gabriel hung upside down 6 feet above the deck of the cargo bay, his maglocks holding him in place. His arms were wrapped tightly around Private First Class Chancy, and he looked down at her, surprised to see her cry. "You okay, Hichiro?" he said. "You hurt?" Chancy looked up at her platoon leader, wiping a tear from her eyes. "No, sir. I lost my flame rifle. You know how much those things cost? I'll never be able to pay for a new one with the shit that the Corps is paying me." "You saved our asses down there," said Gabriel. "We'll buy you a new one." Chancy smiled weakly. "I'd rather have a promotion. Maybe a few days to hang out with you and Warrant Officer Nasri in Vegas." Lieutenant Gabriel rolled his eyes. "Will someone get this little turd off my hands so I can get down from here?" The USS Galveston City remained on station for an additional 48 hours over Willow's World, as the members of 4th Platoon underwent decontamination procedures. In that time, all of the platoon's vidcam footage was sent to the fleet to be scrutinized and examined extensively by scientists, geologists, biologists, astrophysicists, and the clergy. The opposition politicians also wanted to examine the vidcam footage as well, to see if they could find evidence in which to convict the Marines, and, by association their Commander-in-Chief, of any heinous war crimes, real or imaginary. With the USS Galveston City sensors functioning normally now that the entity had been weakened and its beam horn, as the Marines called it, was destroyed, the Galveston City was able to peer down into the dead area anomaly. The entity was still alive being a relative term, and still stumbling around within the dead space which it presumably was responsible for creating. Apparently, the horned entity could not leave that area of dead space to set foot on the surrounding lush, living landscape. The prevailing theory was that the entity was not originally of this planet, having arrived sometime in the past and probably buried itself into the ground, where it slowly began draining the life energy of its surroundings, which, over time, expanded the deadness to over 120 miles in circumference. In the meantime, the entity had used its weird beam to snag any starship which came into range, and dragged it to its doom on the blasted rock formations below, where the entity again fed off the life forces of those it had ensnared, reanimating the corpses whenever they were needed to do its bidding. Basically, it was a giant parasite. Commander Travis had suggested using one of the Galveston's tac nukes on the creature, just in case it had the power to regrow its horn beam again. But that was quickly shot down by the Globo corporations and their R&D departments, who wanted to investigate the numerous wrecks of alien vessels which had been brought down in the dead space. They feared that a tac nuke might damage the alien vessels, which were no doubt holding advanced weapon development secrets that could benefit mankind. For his part, Lieutenant Gabriel couldn't care less. After they leave orbit and the Greyhawk gets underway for Earth, Willow's World and everything associated with it would be the USS Ranger's problem. He was just happy that this deployment was finally over, and that he'd be returning, with his entire platoon, safe and intact. Oh, and that the two snot-nosed VIPs were also safe and sound, he guessed. They were both tucked away in Commander Travis's own crew cabin, since the Corvette didn't have an executive VIP suite. Groaning, Gabriel looked down at his datapad. He was sitting in the galley, enjoying a moment of alone time with a nice hot mug of coffee. He hadn't even finished his report on the Mount Caberu mission, and now he had to write a report about this one too. PFC Chensi strolled up and sat across from him, setting down a tray of cereal on the metal table. "Oh man, sir, these fleet guys know how to live," she said, cutting up a fresh banana and strawberries to put in her cereal. "Maybe I joined the wrong branch." "You most definitely did not join the wrong branch, killer," said Gabriel. "I know," said Chensi. "Oh, by the way, your eyebrows are growing back nicely, sir. Maybe you won't look so hideous by the time we get back." Gabriel rolled his eyes up at her. "Is there a reason you're sitting here picking on my eyebrows, Private?" Chensi scooped a spoonful of fruit-laden cereal into her mouth. "Yes, sir. Are you writing your report on our mission on Willow's World?" "I could be," said Gabriel. "Are you at the part when I dragged those two idiots, VIPs, up to the top of the wreckage and flamed all of them dead things?" "As a matter of fact," said Gabriel, "I'm just getting to that part." "Great," said Chensi, "because I just wanted to make sure that you spelled the word incinerate correctly." Jennifer Nasri stepped out of the shower, wrapped in one of the thick, soft, luxurious towels which made the ultra-luxurious hotel and casino complex towels the most stolen towels on the Las Vegas Strip. It had been over 40 days since they'd successfully completed their mission to Willow's World, and 3 weeks after the USS Kitty Hawk docked at San Diego Orbital Naval Base, before she and Samuel could finally start their 3-week vacation to Vegas. Yes, originally it was 2 weeks, but Seashell Killary had stunk up the cockpit of Jen's gunship again on the way back. Apparently they only had caviar, sardines and boiled eggs in that pantry that they were trapped in for over a week, so naturally Sam would have to cough up another week in Vegas. Secretly, however, Jen was hoping that by their 3rd week in Vegas, Sam might get the hint that Jennifer Nasri Gabriel had a nice ring to it. She walked from the steaming bathroom across the ultra-luxurious king-size bed with a thick, comfortable mattress. Sam was lying in bed, already dressed in a red polo shirt and his favorite well-worn faded blue jeans, waiting for Jen to get out of the shower so they could partake in what was fast becoming their favorite pastime since returning from over a year out in space, attacking the dinner buffet. Sam had the 74-inch vid screen turned to the Galactic News Network. The image on the screen showed Seashell Killary wearing a tight-fitting light blue pantsuit combination, standing together with Hunter Hiding, who was wearing a sharp-looking black suit. The couple was on a large stage inside a crowded arena receiving medals, accolades, and praise for their party leadership while thousands of people clapped and cheered. Red, white, and blue confetti fell from the rafters as veteran GNN senior reporter Runt Wolftart, the most trusted news anchor in the galaxy, sat at a desk and gave a glowing story of Seashell Killari and Hunter Hiding's successful mission to Willowsworld. And after taking a commanding position atop their crashed starcruiser, Runt continued, Hunter Hiding and Seashell Killari rallied the platoon of panic-stricken Marines which, ironically, was sent to rescue them. Though the Marines were racked with fear at the sight of the unnamed danger, Hunter and Seashell used their natural-born leadership gifts, undoubtedly passed to them by their parents, and led the Marines on a dangerous mission which successfully averted a tragedy on that planet. And even though the nature of the mission and the nature of the potential tragedy is considered classified, Runt smiled knowingly into the camera, some anonymous sources high up in the government claim that the unnamed potential tragedy was caused by none other than President Hilania herself. Voters should keep this in mind when the elections roll around. I'm sure that if those thankful Marines were present here today, they'd all encourage citizens in the galaxy to vote accordingly, since clearly this was all President Hilania's fault. Hunter Hiding was joined by his father on the stage, former Vice President Bunker Hiding, and Seashell Killari was joined by her father, Senator William J. Killari, as they announced their intention to run as President and Vice President to defeat President Hilania in the next election by any means necessary. "Really, Sam?" said Jennifer, removing her towel and used it to dry her hair. 8,000 channels on cosmic cable, 1,000 of them porn channels, and this is what you're watching?
"Well, it's on all the channels, Jen," shrugged Samuel. "Even the porn ones," he sighed, as if he'd stepped boot deep into a steaming pile of Xeno droppings. "Still, though, none of that galactic pomp and circumstance bullshit can compare to the little ceremony we had on the deck of the K-Hawk, where we got to promote Sergeant Hernandez to Staff Sergeant, and Private First Class Chency to Lance Corporal. It's nice, really. 42 of us deployed, 42 of us returned. Banged up, probably scared for life, but drunk and happy, just the way we Marines like it." "Well, yeah, that's true," said Jen, climbing on the bed and straddling Sam. With an aggravated groan, Jen grabbed the remote out of Sam's hand and pointed it at the vid screen. "Just do me a favor," she said, pressing the off button. "For as long as we're on Earth, turn that GNN shit off." And so once again, we reach the end of tonight's podcast. My thanks as always to the authors of those wonderful stories, and to you for taking the time to listen. Now, I'd ask one small favor of you. Wherever you get your podcast from, please write a few nice words and leave a 5-star review, as it really helps the podcast. That's it for this week, but I'll be back again same time, same place, and I do so hope you'll join me once more. Until next time, sweet dreams and bye-bye.